Kenneth's stuff on the medieval ages. It's like
It's so interesting.
it will be. I hope it will justify the past 2 years.
Yes. Yes. Well, it puts the past 2 years put medievalism into a framework for interpretation that's impossible without it. Because when we look back at it as moderns, it needs to serve us. It's the purpose of the Middle Ages is to serve us and our identity. We're the people who escaped from that, right? So it needs to be the Dark Age, and it needs to be all these other bad things. But
Hang on, hang on.
but the perspective from the ancients is different.
The Middle Ages are still with us.
Well,
We've
yes.
got some modernity pasted over some Middle Ages.
You're jumping
I
ahead,
mean,
Stephen.
much of the world still lives in the Middle Ages. They just assume they're modern.
Well, they'd like to be living in the Middle Ages, they think. There's a lot of neo-medievalism at work, but neo-medievals are to medievals as, I don't know, I guess televangelists are to Jesus. They sort of, clothe themselves in medieval tropes, but you're not going to find a genuine Joan of Arc anywhere among them.
Well,
But we'll get to that.
a genuine case of the medieval times in recent history, although we don't know how much of it was a product of Hollywood, was the Wild West. I remember, I was reading a book. It's originally a German book, but it was about, the Middle Ages and particularly the 13th century. And basically, if you want to understand this era, it's a Wild West.
Hey,
But
I
you're
don't
a
know about you. I don't know about you, but I'm no longer middle age. I move on to my old age.
You've moved on from the Middle Ages, have you, Phil? Well, we've got three paragraphs at the end of section H, Sophism and Corruption, of chapter 4, Ancient Civilizations, of Kenneth Smith's book, Millennia and Microcosm. The book is yet to be assembled into a book by David and I, but all of it has been written. Doubtless, Kenneth will have to slap his own hands to keep himself from rewriting every chapter of it when he hears that we're about to bring it out, because he does like to go back and re-edit his work. But I think mostly we should just let him add a foreword or an afterword, but leave the text alone, except for gross errors. But what's interesting about this is that we've gone through all these lettered sections in chapter 4, and they've really focused in on a period of transition in Greece, just a century or two of time, really. And everything that comes after that falls under H, sophism and corruption. And what's interesting is you'd think from the balance of text that what it's saying is that the ancient world fell quickly, and then it was over. But in fact, we see from Thucydides that the Greeks are getting into trouble, in the 400s BCE, and Rome doesn't fall until the late 400s CE. So that's about 800 more years that are packed into section H, sophism and corruption, which is just a shocking brush aside of almost 1,000 years of history that Kenneth does. But he
in
does it
part
because he doesn't.
Spengler's point, actually.
Go ahead.
Well, he points out that civilization and decadence go together. You're
Yes,
not truly civilized until you're decadent.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. In the Conan the Barbarian, Conan always has contempt for civilized peoples because of how rude and untrustworthy and stupid they are. All the things that they think about barbarians, he thinks about civilized people. Uh, it's the sophism and corruption that drives Conan up
You
the
might
wall.
say, I think it's the second century BC where Rome has defeated Carthage. The Greek successor states are becoming degenerate, they're declining. That I think is the key era. We still have civilization after that, and people worship that Roman civilization, but it's no longer the bright, creative dream that had been the earlier Greco-Roman times.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to talk a little about that today, but we're gonna honor we're going to honor Kenneth in skimming past 800 years of history in just 3 hours. And there's a reason why he does it. He really is trying to focus on Aristotle's statement that to understand something, you have to understand it in its healthiest form. There are things you can learn by looking at it in its infancy or its dotage or its illness, for sure. It's not that those things shouldn't be looked at, but a newborn cheetah can't crawl and a newborn baby can't crawl, but a human being is not a cheetah. So you only really see the key differences when you see them at the top of their form, and you go, wow, okay, this one can't do what that one can do, and that one can't do what this one can do. You need to separate them. So for him, the ancient epoch is not characterized by Rome. As he says, Rome is the mafia of the ancient world. We're going to get me some of them smart guys. Yeah. And let's pretty up the place. Let's get some sculptors and stuff. Hey, I like the look of that Gaul. Let's go get that. There's kind of the pragmatism of Rome is very much equivalent to the pragmatism of a mafioso. And this goes, you're right. I'm learning Latin, by the way. So that as a preparation for learning ancient Greek, I'm not very far along yet. One of the main books I'm using to learn Latin is this clever book called Familia Romana that doesn't contain a word of English. And it just teaches you Latin starting from very simple sentences and pictures and maps and things. And sentence by sentence, you work your way up to more sophisticated grammar. Well, it's called Familia Romana, which people like to translate into English as Roman family. But when you read the supporting materials, they make clear, oh no, familia doesn't mean like mom and dad and the kids. Familia is, hey, it's a family thing. Like the entire, estate with all the slaves, all the craftsmen and everything, the whole enterprise, the whole social structure is called the familia. And I can't help but think that's like right out of The Godfather. We're a family here. Don't hurt my feelings. There are a lot of these kinds of similarities when you look at Roman history and Roman culture. So, all right, so we're at the third to last paragraph, and we did half of it last week, and I'm not going to go back over what we did before. Last week we were making some distinctions between Banausoi and Douloi and Aristoi and so forth. It's the second half. We left off with Gorgias the Sophist's statement: the power of speech over the disposition of the soul is comparable with the effect of drugs on the disposition of the body. And Kenneth, I can't tell you how important Kenneth believes this quote to be. He comes back to it over and over and over. And part of the reason he does is that moderns believe that our language gives us freedom. That by having, by speaking a modern language, we're able to be sophisticated and objective and see the world the way it really is. But what he would rather we think about is, to what extent does the language frame in which thoughts are easy to think and which thoughts are hard to think, based on what we have words for and what we don't have words for, and what assumptions these words make. Hey, Joe. So, we've talked before in this seminar about the power of nescience. And Kenneth often says the most essential defining features of a culture are not the things that the culture talks about endlessly, but the things the culture never talks about and people can't even think about. Because that tells you where the holes are in their Swiss cheese view of the world. And language is one of the main instruments of that Swiss cheese structure of our perception of reality. So you see this over and over when you see the Romans trying to adopt Greek culture. But Latin is not ancient Greek, even though it will help you with the grammar of ancient Greek and some of the pronunciation of ancient Greek. It's not the same kind of language at all. It's missing enormous numbers of things. There are a huge number of things you could say in ancient Greek that are just inexpressible in Latin. And reading Roman writers, even the smartest of them, the most educated of them, as they attempt to explain ancient Greek authors is fascinating, because it's not unlike reading a modern English translator trying to tell you what Hegel said. And then he translates Verstand is idea and begriff is notion, and tells you that the idea is universal but abstract. But as it happens, the notion is concrete and specific. And you're sitting here going, notion? The English word notion doesn't mean concrete or specific. I have a vague notion about something. Or sewing notions. There's just simply, it just doesn't translate. You lose, there's a Procrustean operation taking place, and you lose everything when you go from Hegel into modern English. But you can see the same thing happening with Seneca when he's writing about what Aristotle had to say about the virtues. For one thing, he's not saying arete, he's saying virtue. And virtue is what makes a man mighty, right? It's vir, man, virtu. What is it that gives me strength and allows me to succeed in the world, that makes me better than other people? That's my virtue. And they sort of corral it into the idea, with Christianity later, they sort of corral it into the idea of the manly thing to do is to submit to God and to do the things that God wants you to do and focus on the behaviors he wants you to focus on. And thus Roman virtue is sort of corralled into, love and truth and humility and things like that, which the Romans might not have, entirely accepted. But nevertheless, that warpage of the Roman virtues into the medieval virtues is as nothing compared to the warpage of ancient Greek arete into Roman virtue. Because ancient Greek arete isn't about, hey, Rome is the best and we're the best because we have these virtues. These virtues are why we win. The aretes have a lot to do with this issue of sophrosune. What's a healthy life? What's not a healthy life? A way of life, an atheia, requires that you have the requisite aretes or excellences, distinctive excellences that make it possible for you to live that atheia. And whether or not you can cultivate those arete, whether they're available to you, depends on your ethos, your character. So all of this stuff is tying your inner nature to the kind of life you're capable of leading. There's a whole architectural construction here about the choices that are available to Homo sapiens and which ones might lead to health and vitality and which ones couldn't possibly do it. And more importantly, of the various ones that could lead to health and vitality, which ones are available to you, sir? Based on your character. You can't be anything. You can't be infinitely adaptable. There's no such, the modern notion that the winner is the one who's the most adaptable, the Greeks saw as a childish fantasy or an adolescent fantasy. They say, no, nobody's good at everything. Nobody's infinitely adaptable. People have strengths and weaknesses. And the trick is to line up your strengths and weaknesses with a way of life that allows you to leverage them for your own survival and health and the survival and health of the species. All of this stuff is tied up in the word arete. None of it is tied up in the Roman word virtue. It's all gone. It's all missing. The entire framework has been lost. And it should be, because the Romans aren't interested in health and vitality. They're interested in winning. They're interested in practical things. They want to make a road. If you try to philosophize to me, I'm going to put a sword in you. Which is why Seneca apologizes at the beginning of his book on the virtues. He says, please don't, basically he's saying, please don't hurt me. I assure you that talking about the virtues has practical benefit. It's going to make you rich. Trust me, you'll make piles of money. Just let me get this. Please don't hurt me. And of course, they did hurt him later on. I mean, this is the thing. If you're trying to be philosophical when you're surrounded by pragmatists, you're going to piss them off. They're not going to be very happy about it. Pragmatism is the anti-philosophy that says, let's not waste time worrying about whether the Holocaust is a good idea or a bad idea. The Holocaust is what I'm trying to do. All I care about is how to do it effectively. Pragmatism is how to succeed. Let's just not worry our pretty little minds about questions of right and wrong. Let's just be the most effective people we can. Yes, I'm in a hole, and yes, I'm trying to solve it by digging. But if you talk about the fact that by digging, I'm making the hole deeper, I'm going to kill you. The important thing is to tell me how to dig more effectively, because that's the tool that I'm using. There's this craziness, this insanity to it. And that we can see that Gorgias the Sophist's comments on the power of language over people and their imaginations is represented by this transition from ancient Greek to Latin, from ancient Latin to medieval Latin, from medieval Latin to modern English. In each step, there's a step down away from questions of how is this species supposed to survive, given the challenges, the deck that's stacked against us? How are we going to make this work? Which is the concern of the ancient Greeks, all the way down to today to, how do I make as much money as possible in the next 3 months? I mean, my quarterly returns need to be better than everybody else's quarterly returns, or I'm going to get bought out. And that's the level we operate at now. We got here step by step. And Section H is talking. The reason he focuses on this is he's talking about the first major step down. And it happens before the Romans even come along and conquer the Macedonian Empire. So, gorgeous. So, let me walk us through the last of this, then we can talk about it. Those who respected nothing but saw all things as means for their rapacity degraded not just the polity and its citizens and laws, but also language, philosophy, and reason to mere instruments for the private appropriation of wealth and power. Right? This is mafia concerns. How do I get rich? How do I get powerful? That's what language is for. That's what philosophy, so-called, is for. That's what my mind is for. And that's what civilization is for. All of you exist to make me wealthy and for no other reason. This is what he's talking about here. That mindset, that barbarism. This is what the Greeks were concerned about. He continues, the political community that was the mother of the highest forms of culture and intelligence. And he's talking here about the pre-logos culture, kind of mythos culture era Greece, or Greece right on the transition, was reduced to a slave for the appetites of tyrannoi. This is a specific historical reference. He's just right here. It just looks like something he happens to be saying. But he's talking about the fact that under the Roman Empire, educated Greeks were usually slaves, and they were slaves that were bought by the nobility in Rome to decorate and pretty up, their villas. Look at me, I got one of them smart guys. What, you bored? Let me bring out the smart guy, and he'll say some smart stuff. I must be, if I can own that smart guy, surely that means I'm smarter than he is, because who owns who, right? I'm the smart guy here. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about the specific reduction of Greek philosophy to a kind of slave operation. They were used to tutor the kids of the Roman nobility and to, say smart stuff at potties, like a dog performing tricks. And then he clarifies by tyrannoi, and of course this is a reference to Oedipus Tyrannus, among other things, as well as to the Romans. He's basically linking the Romans and Oedipus. Individuals by character unfit to rule, abusive and illegitimate despots. And this is how he characterizes the next 800 years of ancient history as it ratchets its way down, 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 down from the pinnacle it was at the transition between mythos culture and logos culture. So that's the paragraph we were on last time, and that's some of the context. Why don't we talk about that for a bit before we go on to the next paragraph? Because I know you guys have thoughts. Hi, Joe. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this is actually interesting to me too, because I think that, I think what you said specifically about how virtue, veritas, means moral strength, this idea of moral strength, which is often attributed to some of the, distortions of masculinity in some ways, and how arete, kind of is speaking to excellence or that which is good, it's an important distinction, because I think that going in between the practical and the essence of something is really kind of what we're talking about here when you're breaking something into parts. So this the one of the again, one of my favorite Tao passages talks about the whole's broken up in the parts, it needs names, therefore and basically there are enough names already. And it's a question of when we just go too far in breaking things up and naming them to a point where they're not necessarily, they lose their meaning. But I will say this though, and this is why I think things like grammar, rhetoric, and some of these tools ought to be taught, because and logic, obviously, because I do think to some degree, kind of having that context to go between the particular and the universal still has its importance. So it's kind of like where I really thinking, I'm thinking in terms of maintaining the essence of a concept is essential. It's essential in kind of seeing new connections. It's essential in how we can relate to each other. But at the same time, there are some aspects of it that, having a set of principles as the virtues in a way, breaking them up in that way, and being able to interrogate yourself is still important I think, to some degree. I think the objectification becomes when we use words to distort our relationships, whether it be with the material world or with other people. So, I mean, it's an interesting thing to kind of really kind of think about. I think that's what we're coming back to, this idea of how virtue and veritas can be used. It's, taking a concept and it's using it in a way that is ultimately going to be distorted from that which is good. But I think that there has to be still a framework to be able to practice the virtues. So in some ways, I think it's that as long as we can go in between the parts and the whole, so to speak, then I think that's ideal. And so, but yes, obviously, it's knowing the essence would be like almost knowing a principle and knowing the particular. So you really need to know the principle that you're actually aligning to. So anyway, I just think there's there is there's a lot of interesting things, and you've spoken too about laws in the past and how we, kind of our reliance on laws and how these laws are actually going to answer all our problems and things along those lines, and how but laws are only as good as well, I mean, essentially, I'll just say this. Laws have to be truly just and not necessarily break things up into categories. So there is the idea of, if you're making laws around the idea of justice, well, then you're not necessarily looking at treating people as objects anymore. And fundamentally, even though they knew better, that's what some of the things that the founders ended up doing. And that, so, and it was their great mistake. But anyway, it's an important thing to be able to have that discussion around language. And anyway, so I've been talking for a while now. I'll shut up.
It's okay. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, the heuristic attitude toward the law is that laws make a fine tool, but they make a terrible master. what you want is the ability to craft and revise the laws and hold them accountable to the deeper principles of life that you're trying to strengthen and uphold. And when one makes the transition from laws as an assistant, as a scaffold for justice, and replaces it with laws equaling justice, that's how you get abominations like the US Supreme Court ruling that an innocent man is guilty because the system said he was guilty, and it doesn't matter if the evidence proves he wasn't. He had his day in court, and the court has decided, and he is now ipso facto guilty. He didn't have to kill anybody, but he's a murderer, and he's going to hang for it because it's the purpose of the system to produce truth of the only kind that a Benalsos cares about. And the Supreme Court justice who made this ruling at the time was a Benalsos, obviously. Only a Benalsos would say, it doesn't matter whether he actually killed him. All that matters is whether the law says he killed him. And if the law says he killed him, then the law says he has to die. That's goodness. That's what goodness is. So, when you deal with systems, you always want to ask the question, who's master here? Are we the master and the system helps us? Like in a medical profession, you learn an enormous amount of guidelines and rules to follow. But you also learn that you have to exercise mature judgment and that there is an enormous variety of things you're going to encounter, and not all of them are going to fit within the framework that's been set up to try to guide the default behavior in the right direction. So there's got to be a time when you transcend the system in search of something that holds better to truth and life and health than the system could ever be capable of. I like to think of, I think Donald and I were talking about Gödel Escher Bach a couple of weeks ago as an influential book. I read it when I was 12, 13, somewhere in there. And Gödel made a huge impression on me. The idea that it's impossible to make a perfect system. Any system you make that tries to describe the world will have two fundamental flaws. And one is that some of the things that it should be including in its truths will be excluded by the structure of the system. It casts a shadow over reality and hides some things that should be included. And the other problem is some things that are false will be included within the system as true because of the imperfections in the structure of the system. And Gödel's proof was aimed at the structure of logic itself, that system. But the inference is, if even logic can't be made coherent and clear and correct, then what hope do all these messier systems we work with have? So they have to always be treated as subordinate to human needs. But for a Benalsos, this need to make systems subordinate to deeper principles, to archai, is a problem because archai don't exist for Benalsos. They're imperceptible. They sound like gibberish. It's like nonsense. There's no such thing. It's you can't put it on a spreadsheet, so it's not a real thing. It's not practical. Truth, justice, love, these things aren't practical, so they have no real value. They want to reduce things down to things that are measurable, and then hold those systematized versions of measurable things up as the ladder that we will then climb and fight over. You certainly see lots of this in Rome. I think another favorite and I probably at this point I'm probably saying it almost every week. Another favorite of Kenneth's is Tacitus's critique of the Pax Romana, when he says they make a desolation and call it peace. Slaughtering everybody and leaving a wasteland behind, you can call that peace. It's certainly quiet, but it shouldn't be called, it doesn't deserve to be called a peace. Martin Luther King Jr. specifically talks about this in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He says, peace without justice isn't any kind of peace at all. Peace can't just be an absence of people, making you uncomfortable. Peace has to be the presence of justice and vitality. And if it's not those things, it isn't peace. And he's echoing Tacitus when he says that. I think consciously. I think he knows it's Tacitus. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This paragraph that you've put up, this whole paragraph is instructive. And last week, we talked about it. So I went back and reread my Timothy Snyder book on tyranny. And the first sentence stood out to me because he said, history does not repeat, but it does instruct. And I think that's where we are today, because I think if we read all these lines here, all this information here, this is the way our society is functioning today. Where we are reduced to a slave of our appetites, and that individuals of character unfit to rule and are abusive and intelligent despots. And to finish, I want to mention something that you talked about, judgment, that you're required to use your judgment. And that's one of the outgrowths of mistakes. And then you get experience, then you develop judgment. And this whole abortion issue is turning to be very, very sad in America today when we look at maternal deaths, because we've decided that the medical judgment is not good to make a decision where you need to intervene in the care of the patient. And so women are dying. And I feel very sad about that. And I don't know at what point in our culture or at what point in the Greek culture can we find an equivalent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. The idea that it's the job of the church to intervene and say what you're allowed to think and what you're allowed to do at every level of society, that's a medievalism. Totalitarian control over people is not an ancient virtue or value. It's not an ancient value. And you can see it in dozens of ways. There's dozens of really obvious ways in which the ancient world fails to do the things that moderns or medievals might do as a system. It fails to try to control, fails to try to exterminate other religions right off the bat, which tells you a lot. Medievals were big on that. We want to get rid of everything except the approved version of medieval Christianity. But you see it in the modern world too. When people, before we got started, Steve was talking about sort of neo-medievals, people who look back longingly at the medieval epoch and want to recreate a theocracy. And you see, when they do that, the theocracy they want to recreate tends not to be the one of the peaceful, loving, quiet, monks and sisters, the Franciscans, people like that. They want to recreate the Inquisition. The whole reason they want to bring it back is there's people that they're angry at, they think, and they want to punish those people, but they don't want to seem like a bad guy, so they want God on their side. They want God to bless them and say, God commands us all to do this thing, and I'm merely his agent. The fact that I get a real thrill out of hurting people and telling them what to do, we just won't talk about that. I'm just going to pretend that this is God's desires here. And in this, this is partially a emotional alchemical transformation of their frustrations, of their failure to thrive in the modern world, and looking for a way to direct that anger righteously at somebody. So it's weird because, when you work in the medical profession and you're taught how to have sensitive, intelligent, delicate conversations about difficult topics, like, is it time to pull the plug, or should you have an abortion? These are hard issues, and medical professionals are given classes on how to deal with this sort of thing, and they talk to each other, and they develop policies to try to do these things in the most humane way possible. And then you encounter these people who are like, no nuance, no humanity, no discretion. I just want a big hammer and I want to hit everybody who disagrees with me. To a medical professional, it can feel like you're in the presence of primitivism, right? Like you've been trained for a Star Trek world and you're coming face to face with something primitive. But that's the modern world's misrepresentation of so-called primitive peoples. The development of this kind of totalitarian ambition is not ancient at all. It's not indigenous at all. It's modern. It's medieval and modern, that we got this idea that it's not enough to control our own lives. which generally are a mess when we seek to control others. But now we want to control everybody else's life too. And everything has to be according to some grand script that we just happen to be in possession of. This is not primitive. This is a mutation, and it's a, sophisticated mutation. It's not normal for animals to look at all the other animals of their kind and think, man, if only I could control all of them. You cannot get a cheetah to try to corral all the other cheetahs in the world and get them to run the way it does or to sit the way it does. It just doesn't occur to them, right? It's their sophrosune points them more in the direction of focusing on the things that lead to health, not these crazy ideological struggles. Ideology and totalitarianism are really only possible for Homo sapiens as a result of the things we've talked about over the past months. It's the thing that allows us to be smart, allows us to be stupid in spectacular ways that no animal would dream of. You can't, even an amoeba. I mean, how primitive an animal do you want to look at? Amoebas don't run around in a totalitarian, ecstasy trying to control each other. They don't. They just don't. It's not within their realm of possibilities. This is a unfortunately sophisticated operation. So you won't find a lot of precedents in the ancient world. It's not that you won't find any. I mean, there's diversity. I'm sure some crazy somewhere is telling everybody what to do, but mostly they aren't. Not at that level. Steve, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'd be inclined to say it's not a question of people going back to the medieval era. They're still there. And actually, the medieval era is a bit too advanced. I'd say the vast majority of people living in civilizations today are still living with Egypt and the pharaohs. We have a certain degree of modernity painted over our medieval selves, and that's increasing, that's progressing. Anyway, what I was going to say is Joe brings to mind for me what seems to be the widespread concern of the intellectual. And I have a problem with it, and that is, I think this was something Wilhelm Reich alerted me to when he was complaining about the methods that Freud was using. Freud was into that mode. He was into the idea of finding the essence, drilling right down into the mind to find that one essence, like everything above that, all the layers of the mind of the person, everything above that is inconsequential. It's not essential. It doesn't matter. And Reich started to think that was an error. And, he's pictured standing back, and if he felt he had to peel away the layers and look at the outer layers of a person, not just disregard them, not barge past them. It's like a cat. If we take a cat and we search for the essence of catness, we'll do that by pulling it to pieces. Only trouble is it won't work when we try to put it back together. But just drill into it without standing back. What does a cat do? What do I see? Its routine is, and what are all its behaviours? No. In the modern era, just look for that essence and screw into everything. Just turn that screw, in the wood. And, if it won't go any further, turn it a bit harder. This seems to be characteristic of a lot of technicians. The technical aspect of most people is it's not balanced. Something that broadly came with the axial age. You look at the minds of the axial age, from the Greek philosophers to the Chinese philosophers, a thing which came up was a question of balance. I think I've explained before, that seems to have gone out the window lately. Nothing exceeds like excess. This is what advertising is teaching us. This is, you know, more of a good thing can only be better. I remember the night Trump got elected, and I went along to see my friends, and of course, they despised Trump greatly, and they knew I had a little bit of a liking for him. I hadn't even bothered to, check the results or anything. And I said, I think one of the problems is too much education today. I said to the woman's son, who was a school teacher. And then he said, I was being a bit joking in a sense. And he said, how can there be too much education? It's like, well, the role they have for education in life is how long you plan to send people to school in the normal way that, you consider. It's not like a person might seek education later on, but how many years do you think it's going to take to equip somebody in some way? You're going to spend what? Everything from the age 5 to 25, 20 years. There's going to be a minimal education. I'd probably say, well, you have to give people a certain minimal education, but after that, I'd rather people approach it out of interest. I want to know, I want to go there, really, rather than what's been pushed today, where the educational institutions have simply become money-making enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Can I
Nothing
say
exceeds-
something? Very.
Okay.
I just
Go
want
ahead,
to
Jen.
interject because this is a pet peeve of mine. Steve, how much education can one have? I think it is Heraclitus that says, abundance of knowledge does not wisdom make. And so you have people who have absolutely no education and are very wise. And when they talk about wise, they understand the virtues of life. And for me, the most important one is kindness, right? So there's no amount of education. And I also know there are people who are very, very educated and they have an alphabet behind their names and they have absolutely no wisdom because this is an integrative process. And I really wanted to talk to you on that. In fact, I was reading something where they're looking at the impact of education, impact of AI on education. So instead of memorization, they're turning it into a process, and it's called metacognition. And if we're going to teach our kids how to evaluate things by a process instead of memorization, then I think we're on the way. But I just want to say, abundance of learning does not wisdom make. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you both. That's definitely Heraclitus. He's like, much learning does not teach wisdom, or else it would have taught. And then he proceeds to list 4 famous educated people who he considers to be idiots. It's and you put that side by side with his statement that seekers after wisdom have to acquaint themselves with a great many particulars, and you can see that he's talking about a paradox. And I think you guys are summarizing it well, which is it's possible to stuff people's heads full of facts and have them come out the other side not better people in any particular way. And that runs up against the modern doctrine that education is the source of all good. That if someone is evil, you should teach them a lot. Once they know how to make nuclear bombs and, and how to work the constitutional processes to change the laws to round up all the Jews and exterminate them, they'll become good people. They would never, if knowledge is power and you hand power to a con man, what you get as a result is not a kinder, gentler, wiser human being. You get a more powerful con man. There's this, and it's common sense an experiential sense, but our doctrine doesn't allow for it. Star Trek, the Star Trek series are constantly implying that ignorance is the source of bad behavior and education is the source of good behavior. And I used to love that when I was younger and an intellectual, but I've come to understand, what can we say about knowledge is power? Well, first of all, power corrupts. And second of all, putting power in the hands of a bad person doesn't make him a good person. History teaches us people don't become good people when you hand them power. Now, I'm all for education in general. I mean, because Heraclitus says you gotta acquaint yourself with a great many particulars. But particulars, he's talking about concrete reality. He elsewhere says the things he prizes above all else are the things that you directly experience in life and not the things that people tell you. When people share their pet theories with you, he doesn't particularly value that. But when you go out into the world, and you look at the trees and get your hands in the dirt and you investigate, it knocks some of the nonsense out of your head. He's got this proto-science orientation of he wants a healthy dose of reality involved in what we do. So I look at how did people used to get educated in the past before we created our, worker factories, which we have now. We mass produce utensils for the modern world, human resources. And people used to learn in their lives. There used to be a focus on, if you were going to become a carpenter, you would learn an enormous amount through the work, through the apprenticeship and journeyer stages, as well as at your mastery level when you could run grand experiments. There was an expectation that life is a lifelong process of learning, but not a lifelong process of indoctrination. It's a process of coming to the world with your mind alive and interested. Like Stephen says, focus on are you engaged with learning? Are you curious about the world? If there was something that I wanted educational systems to teach more than anything, it would be to help light that fire or help people to cultivate it in themselves. Because once you've done that, there's very little that you can tell that person that they couldn't eventually find out themselves now that they're motivated. But if you just stuff people's heads full of facts and demotivate them so that they see education as this dreary process of passing test after test after test, the second they graduate, they stop learning. They turn their minds away. They're like, learning is terrible. I got to stop it as soon as I'm free to do so. I was lucky in that I had a mix of teachers. I had some of both kinds. And so I could compare and contrast growing up what happened with the ones who lit a fire in us to learn and then turned us loose versus the ones who were like memorize, test. And then, most of the class was turned off and didn't want to learn. So there's something in all this stuff you guys are talking about that's very profound. But we'll have to come back to it because it's a little, it's not like it's going to go away as a topic, and it's a little off topic
Okay.
at the moment. It's related, right? We're talking about corruption, and these are ways of corrupting the educational system, and that has tremendous effects on the viability of the society. But we'll come back to it. I see there's a pile of hands, so I'm going to move on to Joe. Come off mute, Joe. Tell us what's on your mind.
One of the things that I think that we're kind of, that we've been talking about is this idea of control. So control on how we can actually manipulate the world. So manipulate the world and objects in it. And so the more that you do that, the further that you get away from nature. So this is like kind of this important part. What is the nature of the concept that we're actually talking about? So this idea of even dominating nature is derived from some of these ideas of being able to control and manipulate objects in the world. And so when we do that, domination means that you're kind of also restricting the ability for people as we were talking about just a moment ago with Sharon, is talking about judgment. So, because the more that you kind of create a boundary for something, and there is this one way of thinking, that's a form of control. And that's where what happens from there is you kind of get to this idea of absolutism. And that this is how every case medically should be treated. This is how every scenario should be treated. And so, as opposed to using our judgment as to what could be and how things could be different in this particular circumstance. And what happens is you just get away from the idea of context. And that's really, I think, the really important part, is that our everyday experiences are then kind of dictated to us, as opposed to us being able to make decisions based on the context that we're in. So that's especially true with medical decisions, right? So there's a limiting people's decision-making process becomes a form of control. And so I think that that's really, when we're talking about even language and how we're drawing these boundaries with these concepts, that we have to consider that, you know, these are artificial boundaries that are actually being created that are dictating everyone's behavior, and it actually leads to inherently a dictatorial type of approach. And the need to dominate nature versus actually work within it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that looking at what the nature of things are is one of the key points.
So you're going to make Aristotle happy.
Yeah, it is. It's an Aristotelian concept, but, you know, then he goes into his different forms of ideas, what he thinks. Yeah, but yes, you're right. Absolutely.
Fusay.
Yeah. So, anyway, so that's just yeah, some thoughts about how the distinction is then what is excellence?
Yeah.
As we were talking about,
Yeah.
versus this is what virtue is. And yeah, so anyway, that's you know, that these are all important points, and I do think that there's also this other aspect of it. The further we get away from nature, the more mechanistic we become. The worse the outcome is normally going to be. So anyway, thanks.
Good stuff, Joe. Thanks. James, what's on your mind, James? Come off mute. Oh, you there, James? You're still muted.
Oh yeah, here sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, just to follow up what Joe was just saying, getting away from nature. So the software scene seems to be this kind of inherent characteristic within our nature, right? Would that be true?
Aristotle would say sophrosune is a characteristic that everybody but us has. All the animals have it. Plants probably have it to some extent,
Right.
but people are lacking it and have to learn how to simulate it.
Okay. So we have to simulate it. So if you're comparing it to what the animals have, they have instincts. So we have to simulate. But does that mean that we have something inherent within us that allows us to be able to simulate that? And so,
yeah,
the idea of intuition would be something that is a possibility for Safrasuni, right?
Right. So the idea is that let's take a few minutes on this. The question you're raising is probably the most important question to the ancient Greeks. So I'm going to cheat and use the cheetah again. And the cheetah will stand in for all animal species and presumably plants and fungi as well. So all over the world, all cheetahs have a common ethea. And I guess I'll throw words in here. Healthy, sustainable way of life. That's the Greek term ethea. And that ethea means that as long as cheetahs successfully pursue that way of life, cheetahs will thrive, and so will the ecosystems that cheetahs are part of. They won't thrive at the expense of the ecosystem. They'll thrive in a way that improves the ecosystem, like the study about wolves in Yellowstone and how they made everything better for it, or the study on the American bison and how people assumed that if you turned bison herds loose, they would overgraze, but instead, the grasslands got healthier. they did the opposite, of what happens when we bring sheep out onto the range. The bison were actually making it healthier. They had an ethea, and if your way of life doesn't do those things, it is not an ethea. So there is no ethea of tobacco executives or petroleum executives. That's not an ethea. That's the modern version of a way of life, i.e. an anti-ethea that makes things worse the more successful they are. So the trick to an ethea is that, most species have one way of life they're supposed to pursue. It involves a certain number of options, and it involves a suite of instincts and emotions that allow them to modulate their focus. So when they're hungry, the cheetah is really obsessed with the gazelle. But after eating, the cheetah becomes obsessed with cleanliness. The cats do the same thing, domestic cats. All the cat species do. After they're all messed up, their fur is all messy and stinks and can be detected from miles away because it's covered in gore, right? They become obsessed with grooming themselves and each other until they're absolutely fastidious again. And that's necessary. They wouldn't be able to pursue the stalk and chase, stalk and pounce ways of life if they reeked the way that a hyena or reeks. They have to be absolutely clean. So it's built into their instincts that they want to do all of the different things that have to be done as part of that way of life, and they modulate successfully between them appropriate to the current conditions that they're in. Now, Homo sapiens is different. We're the animal that doesn't have one ethea. We have multiple ethea. We have multiple possible ethea. We don't even know what all the ethea are for Homo sapiens. Nobody does. Nature doesn't know. It's an unknown. However, to get us dislodged from being locked into a single ethea, what nature did was rip apart our web of instincts. So we still have the capacity for enthusiasm, but the enthusiasm is not, locked onto the gazelle or taking a bath or carrying your baby cheetah cubs to someplace safer the way it is for a cheetah. Our enthusiasm could be about anything. And this is our great danger as well as our great strength. We could become enthusiastic about being fishermen. We could become enthusiastic about being carpenters. We could be enthusiastic about growing corn. Or we could become enthusiastic about old Star Trek episodes, or enthusiastic about, exterminating, all of a minority population within our society because we subscribe to an ideology. We could be enthusiastic about anything. When you compare the number of things we could be enthusiastic about to the number of things that actually qualify as ingredients in an ethea, we have a signal to noise problem in our species, right? Huge numbers of things we could be excited about are bad for us. And yet, if we are enthusiasts for that thing, that unhealthy thing, we are just as enthusiastic about that as the farmer is about farming. There's nothing in our character that makes us lose interest in the things that make us sick. And all other animal species, so this is the other half of sophrosune. There's sophron and there's phronesis. And the sophron is a they define it, God help us, they define it in the dictionaries as moderation. But what it really is that there is something in us that turns away from the things that we shouldn't be focusing on. Cheetahs will naturally turn away from a spreadsheet or a pile of machine guns, right? They're not interested. They might sniff it, but then they walk away. They'd much rather be taking a bath or, carrying their cubs somewhere. They're very interested in the things that are healthy for them. We can be interested about anything. So, but let's ignore for a moment all the unhealthy anti-atheia and just zero in on a sample atheia. Let's say corn farmers. We're gonna be into farming corn, right? These Homo sapiens has, through process of trial and error over tens of thousands of years, come to the point where some of us can pursue a sustainable way of life based around corn. Now, that way of life requires us to develop within ourselves nascent archetype that, Homo sapiens could have a lot of different archetype, not an infinite number, but there's a variety in there. And when you find somebody who has the right mix in their character such that it can be cultivated, then they can develop the archetype necessary to be exceptional corn farmers. Other people who don't have the capacity in their own character for those archetype, they're going to be at best mediocre corn farmers. Maybe they should do something else. But again, let's set the people aside for a moment who couldn't do this, who don't have the right character, and focus on the people who, partially by happenstance of genetic upbringing, partially by a cultivation by their family and their culture, they actually get pointed in the right direction. Their character develops the right archetype, right, to be good at this, and they have the right character to generate that archetype. And what happens is, over the course of developing experience of working in this, both failures and successes, our minds begin to develop an intuition. The intuition is learned. It's the unconscious part of our understanding, as opposed to the conscious part. And it's much, much, much bigger than the conscious part. The conscious part is what, 7 plus or minus 2 details at a time? The unconscious is everything we can remember from our lives at any point. It's a vast well of possibilities. So the way to think about intuition is not that it's a natural inborn talent, but rather that it is a phenomenon that results when we are working at something with interest over a long time and develop a lot of varied experiences around it. And as a result, our unconscious gradually grows wise about this topic. And we start to have, long before we could put into words what's wrong with somebody's idea about what to do with the corn, we have this immediate shock of intuition. It goes, no, that's not going to work. And then it might take our conscious mind a while to catch up and figure out what was it that our unconscious noticed and was it was ringing. We can't have coherent conversations with our unconscious, but it can ring the bell of our intuition and give us, a feeling about it that can then guide our conscious mind to turn and look and say, there's something here I should be focusing on. What is it? Oh yeah, you can't plant corn on bare rock. That's the problem. Let's not do that. The intuition kind of comes in. But if I'm not a corn farmer, or if I'm a mediocre corn farmer, I have no useful intuition about corn farming. I may think I have intuition about it. My unconscious, I might be able to talk my unconscious into supplying answers to questions about corn, but they're going to be bullshit answers. My intuition is going to be terrible on this topic because this is not my atheia. I don't have the body of experience. So this is what's interesting about Homo sapiens and intuition. Cheetahs all have the same atheia all over the world. So they all develop similar kinds of intuition. Now their individual experiences will vary in terms of depth and quantity and qualities. So they aren't clones of each other. They have slightly different perspectives. But in general, if a cheetah could talk, it could tell you, its intuition would tell it very wise things about how to and how not to live the life of a cheetah.
Right,
But with Homo sapiens, we don't have that kind of uniformity. Our intuition develops within an atheia, a way of life,
right.
if we're good at it and if we spend time at it.
But isn't that what Nietzsche is really telling us? Where he was telling us that the whole point of that he was making is that that you're talking about the unconscious, right? So isn't he talking about the unconscious will, right? Which is the method is to forget the representations, forget the ideas, the ideologies, and these kind of obsessions that you're talking about in our conscious mind. And if you can forget those, then you achieve a kind of a great health. You know, great health is a kind of return of this inherent arate or saprasini.
Yeah.
Is it? It's so, you know, was Nietzsche right then that there is a kind of he's pointing to this will that we are part of, just like the chia is part of that overall comprehensive will that we're dictated by. And if you follow that, then you supposedly are in tune or in harmony with that saprasini, right? That kind of moderation, that perfect balance between yourself and the world, right?
You could be. It all depends on whether the thing that you're, I mean, so what he's trying to say is when you're tangled up in ideologies, they encourage you not to pay attention to evidence that contradicts your ideology.
Right.
And they also encourage you to disregard any intuition you have that there's something wrong with your ideology.
Sure.
Ideologies want you to subscribe to them, and they want to control what you pay attention
Right,
to.
right.
And what he's saying is if you can, to the extent to which you can disentangle yourself from the ideologies that you've been woven into throughout your life, it allows you greater access to your gnosis, right? Which is the part of you that focuses on what you really feel, what you really remember, what you really sense. And those things are the path that can lead you in the direction of vitality. So I think he's saying there's a possibility, and I think what he would say here is there is in us a deep thing that's not sophrosune itself, but is a curiosity and a capacity for being intoxicated by beauty and health. There's something in us that's willing to pay attention to those things if it's not trained out of us.
Right.
And that part in us, when we're deep in an ideology far from reality and health, that part in us deep down inside us is yearning to get out of the mess that we've made and get back to the first principles of Homo sapiens, which is to try to point our enthusiasms in a healthy direction. So
right. So when the critique should be directed at those ideologies that take us away, detached from our natural inherent character, right?
Yes.
And when the critique should be directed at the Platonic notion of forms that are, you know, outside of nature. And that's an ideology, overarching ideology that was a foundation for Christianity and the whole history of Western philosophy and culture that Nietzsche was pointing at. That took us away from, distracted us from our natural will that's part of nature. And so we should be closer to being aligned with the cheetah, you know, in that sense. But we don't have instincts like the cheetahs have, but we have intuitions that could be, you say, developed.
It could be cultivated,
Cultivated, right?
Yeah. And you know, the thing about our intuition is that, you know, that it's close. Our intuition and our capacity for enthusiasm are related in the sense that they can latch on to anything. So it could latch on to something that points us in the direction of sophrosune. But, you know, if we spend a lot of time in the anti-atheia of being a day trader, or one of those people who calls up old people and, you know, cons them out of their life savings to make a buck, if that's what we do for a living, we can develop intuition about that and learn. We could get this really deep-rooted sense of satisfaction from having, you know, ripped off some old person and caused them to become homeless and live on the streets. Right. And that's an example of the way in which our intuition and enthusiasm have the capacity to go wildly awry. Because you could never get a cheetah to be excited about that. It's just, and it's not because it's dumb. It's because nature, through a long process of evolution and trial and error, has produced a set of enthusiasms and instincts, you know, intuitions that pointed in the right direction for its health and vitality. We lost all that.
Yeah, so, I have a second question. The modern pragmatists like Wim James and you know, and others, weren't they trying to get us back to this kind of inherent relationship that we have with the world that is not based on ideology or some supernatural, idea that takes us away from our daily usefulness of, of how we behave and so forth. But when that kind of pragmatism differ from the kind of pragmatism that you mentioned about the Romans, about and associating that with kind of a mafioso kind of attitude, which is
Yeah. I mean,
probably,
Kenneth,
but I was just wondering if the modern pragmatism is a little bit more concerned with getting us back to a true kind of a pragmatism that is related to self-sustaining.
yeah, this is where, I mean, Kenneth would say that the ancient Greeks would want you to contrast Sophrosyne and pragmatism and not unite them, and say pragmatism is all about paying no attention whatsoever to Sophrosyne and focusing how to get what you want without ever asking whether you're wanting the right things. Sophrosyne is about wanting the right things,
Okay.
and using your intelligence to move in those directions. Where the right things aren't the things that give you more power and money, but they're the things that lead to a more sustainable, healthy way of life. And so it's really more useful to contrast pragmatism and Sophrosyne and say Sophrosyne is the reality-based thing that all these animals have that we should be trying to rediscover and nurture in ourselves. And it is in direct opposition to pragmatism that says, don't worry your head about those complicated things, just focus on paying your bills or screwing the next guy. That's a nice pragmatic goal to have in modernity.
Yeah, because if you're relating Sophrosyne to the cheetah, the animals that have this inherent pragmatism of sustaining themselves and in terms of achieving great health and so forth, just like Nietzsche describes what great health is, right? Is to be really acting and behaving, thinking and behaving according to that kind of deep will within us that we're part of that world, right?
Yeah, this is a major. I mean, Kenneth talks about Nietzsche as being a vitalist. He's talking about what you're talking about. He's saying Nietzsche is very concerned with this issue of how have we lost our way so that we're not focused on the things that make us healthier and more vital as a species. How have we come to the point where we focus on the things that make us sick? And when he says man is a sick animal, this is what he's talking about. That we're it's not just that we are sick, but that we embrace sickness because we can't tell the difference between health and sickness. We could be enthusiastic about things that make us sick, and we could hold in contempt the things that make us healthy, and the whole time never realize that we've confused the two with each other, and that's the thing we've got to solve. So going back to Nietzsche the way you do, I think is something that Kenneth would applaud on this particular topic. He has an enormous amount of his critique of the modern world is based on this issue of health, and are we aiming at it or are we aiming away from it? But you see how even the word health, that's obviously an English translation of the German, but even in the German and English both struggle a bit around this issue. So I read Nietzsche for years without ever cluing in that by health he was referring to Sophrosyne, because I didn't know the word Sophrosyne. I didn't know what I was missing. He spoke Greek. He started as a philologist before he was a philosopher, translator. He was focused on the Greek language, and in it, in Greek philosophy and history, he discovered this overriding concern with Sophrosyne. But then when he tried to put it into words, I'm not sure that it always comes across to his readers, partially because we just lack the concepts. We have no framework for Sophrosyne. And it's why it's so useful that Kenneth uses his opening chapter 4 here to focus on immersing us in the Greek worldview long enough to be able to fill in some of the gaps in our perception of reality and in our perception of ourselves and what our strengths and weaknesses are. So, I mean, great topics, James. Thank you. Phil, what's on your mind? Come off mute.
Yeah, it seems like human beings are in a funny place because since we're not tied to any basic instincts, but we have an advantage in a way because we have the ability to think, and we have many, many possibilities that opens up to us. And it seems to me like that's an advantage. And I think, kind of going back to to Heidegger, I mean, I think he's sort of saying that something like having a systematic approach to understanding in some ways, it covers over the primordial way of relating to the world, relating to understanding. And we've lost that. And I kind of think that in some sense, maybe the play Antigone was addressing that issue. But my thought is that it seems to me, since we live in a civilized society, in other words, human beings live by and large in a community. And anytime you have a community, there's within the community a structure itself. So like, amoeba is free to kind of do anything he wants because it's not, but as soon as it gets tied up in the community, it becomes a coral. And I think there's a structure in which the thing must live in. And I think that it then it defines itself that it's hard to tell whether that's an individual or just a colony of individuals. So in some sense, one of the things that human beings have is that because we have this diversity of abilities, of possibility of thinking in certain ways and cognizing the world in certain ways, then in a sense, we have the ability for what's called, I guess, specialization and diversity and specialization. And that helps in terms of constructing a community because we have a lot more understanding, a lot more technical, whatever, all sorts of things that brought into the world because none of us could understand all the things that everybody else understands. So in some sense, so this comes back down to a kind of almost environmental relationship because ecological relationship, because a human being must be related to this sort of ecology of civilization itself, the structure. Animals are thrown into the world of the real world, the world of nature, and they adapt to that in a certain way. But human beings have become more and more distant to that because we're thrown into civilization. And that has its own structures that we have to coordinate and adapt to. And in some sense, and I think that's why we also need some sort of structure. Now, the problem is, I think we have a tendency, I think starting with, I personally think a misunderstanding of Plato. We're starting with a structure that almost seems like a mechanical structure, a mathematical structure of the pure form itself. And I think Plato, the forms were much more looser because they were aspiration of creating a projective, a theoretical, possible understanding that, in a sense, guides us. And what that seems to mean is that I think when you have an absolute structure, then it creates too rigid of a structure, and so therefore you really have to create a social structure that somehow is a little bit like nature, that's much more flexible, a flexible structure, or at least a semi. And we do kind of have that. For instance, you're driving your car, you go to this stoplight. It's a reasonably hard structure. You're supposed to stop, even though there's no cars around it. You're supposed to stop. But there are like other structures within the road, like, for instance, a flashing yellow light or a stop sign. You make a quick stop, you look around, you go ahead. I think how to structure a kind of colony, in a sense, a society, is that you have to have some hard structures, a skeletal structure in a way, and then you have to have a lot more looser structures in a way. So when you're walking in the road, there's no rule how you walk. I mean, but when you walk, you run into another person, not you to run into another person approaching you. You automatically, out of a kind of social structure of understanding, everybody moves slightly to the left and right, and they don't bump into each other and cause trouble, right? So you have to have this ability to understand the loose structure in terms of, in a sense, making judgments about how the situation would be. And I think the problem with our society now is that we have hardened the structure so much that, in a sense, people can't make that kind of more primordial judgments about things. I'm thinking, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, well, probably probably the closest animals to us are like ants, because they have a society. They are almost a single being itself, an ant colony, in a way. I mean, there's definitely individual ants, and they're all specialized. There are soldier ants, there are foraging ants, all sorts of things, right? And so they have a society, and in a sense, the soldier ants will fight to the death to protect the colony. And I wonder whether we have created a structure in a way that, in some sense, there are individuals, but there's a living organism itself, called a city or even a nation, although that's a little too big to be one unit. And that the soldiers are there, they're fighting for America or fighting for Russia or China, and they're doing the thing. And it's like they are sacrificing themselves, because whether they feel that internally and make a judgment that way, or whether they've been sort of brainwashed, that's what you do. It almost seems like the nation itself, or the city itself, has a structure that, in some sense, in some way, could care less about you as an individual, because it wants to survive as a city or colony. And I kind of think that, in some sense, that's the way it was even in the Greek states, because the most important thing is that Athens has to survive, or Sparta has to survive, and you're just part of the function. It's kind of like, because yes, you are an ant, but the real significance of that organism is the colony itself. And I think we might be caught in that, except we have much more possible thinking of diversity. The ants, they are kind of like these, I guess, automatic, sort of like
Yeah.
instincts. So
Yeah.
I think we're caught in a funny place, because we're constantly having to adjust how much of this is myself and how
Yeah.
much of this is my community itself. And we always have to keep that in balance. And there's some people who, like like some ants that doesn't want, I guess, maybe, I don't know if there's any ants that want to rebel against the colony itself.
No, because Mama feeds us. If it weren't for Mama, we would starve to death if we're as
So
ants.
we have to have an education system that, in a sense, on the one
Yes.
hand, teaches enough
Yes.
hard rules and what to understand, and enough loose enough and ambiguous enough that you have to be able to make judgment. There's so many judgments you have to
Yeah.
make,
Yeah.
that having hard rules doesn't provide enough to coordinate a society. So, it seems like Hegel is talking about zeitgeist, the community, not the individual.
Yeah, let's riff on this. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the ants. They're a useful example here. The one misleading thing about my previous discussion about Athea, I'm sure there's others, is that I sort of implied that there's a way of life that's viable, and that's how it is for the other animals, but it's not how it is for us. We are more like the ants, where we need multiple Athea to be braided together to make a whole viable community. There are very few, if any, human ways of life that are complete, where if everybody does that same thing, we'll all survive. And part of the reason for that is the other animals have cheats, right? I mean, the cheetah can run really fast. We can't. We don't have that ability. And it's able to lean harder into its Athea and squeeze it for more juice of life. We're sort of generic animals. And so we can do all these different atheia, and we can squeeze each of them for a certain amount of life. But generally, we need other atheia to complement the one that we've chosen, or we'll die. So when you look at this, there's a whole area here around what is the definition of a tribe that moderns are really weak on. We're weak on them because we're taught that the tribe is a primitive bad thing. So anytime we want to, insult somebody, we call them tribal. Oh, tribal rivalries. Those people, they can't make peace because they're too tribal. When we say those things, we're being idiots. That's not how tribes work. That's not why they developed. They didn't develop because they were a terrible mistake in evolution, and we all died 100,000 years ago because we lived in tribes. They're a huge advance. They're a huge advance. And what a tribe is a situation in which it grows beyond the family, first of all, right? Families grow into clans. Clans follow, and this is a part we're missing too. We hear about the bear clan and the wolf clan and the otter clan. We think it's just like a branding. I wear a otter on my t-shirt. Yay, I'm the otter clan. That's not it at all. It's that, the caribou clan, and by the way, this is from Cornford's From Religion to Philosophy. I shared a link. You can read it for free on the Internet Archive. You can download it, read it on your computer. This is where he takes an anthropological look at the origins of Greek philosophy and shows how it arose from the religion, and shows how the religion arose from earlier practices. So he's basically digging into the roots of Greek society, and things that I read here lined up nicely with other anthropological stuff that I've read. This is what I'm about to feed you. There's a little bit of anthropology, and it goes like this: the tribe is what happens when we realize that we need different specialized atheia, and we need to braid them together. So on the one hand, we have to be separate because we can't be infinitely adaptable. We have to pick our atheia. Are we a fisherman or are we a carpenter? Because they are not the same thing. If we try to do both, we're going to be mediocre at both. We need some exceptional fishermen and we need some exceptional carpenters. And so there's a carpentry clan and there's a fishing clan, and the tribe welds that both allows the differentiation of the atheia to separate them, and then welds them back together into a whole, usually by, among other things, having exogamous marriage matches between clans. So on the one hand, you're separate, but on the other hand, you marry across and cross thread and link yourselves together. And thus you have an interest in, whether the fishermen are surviving because that's your daughter over there. And you care whether the caribou people are surviving, because that's where you came from before you married your wife and, became a carpenter. So there is this knitting that happens in a tribe where you're simultaneously differentiating and knitting together. And tribes are all different from each other. I mean, the configuration of clans, what your specialties are, it depends on the land you're in. What does it have? I mean, if you don't have reindeer, you're not going to be reindeer herders. I'm sorry. It's not going to fly. If you don't live near, rivers or lakes or oceans that have fish, you're not going to be fishermen. So what's interesting about Homo sapiens, and perhaps the reason that this evolved in us and probably in our predecessor species, is that if you drop Homo sapiens in just about any viable terrain, over the generations and thousands of years, through trial and error, we can develop cultures that include identifying and nurturing and becoming good at various atheia that we then weave together into a unique combination of ways of life that works great for that specific place. This is where we link the notion of tribalism with being indigenous. To be indigenous is not to be generic, it's to be concrete and specific. You're not just like a shaman who's good at plants wherever you happen to go. You're good at these plants, the plants where you live. You know them like the back of your hand. You're good at these animals. You know that the inner bark of the cedar tree is soft and can be made into clothing, which would not occur to most people. It's a tree. How can there be clothes in the bark? It doesn't make sense, right? So this indigenization in which you delve deep into a specific area in the land leads to the formation of a variety of atheia and the cultivation of clans that raise their kids to develop the character with the arete necessary to pursue that Athea well. This is how you get to sort of large scale threads of the society that the tribe both creates those and then knits them together into the fabric of
Well,
life.
are we as individuals already
Oh,
a
Phil, I can't
summation of
quite hear you.
clans? Because we have a heart clan, we have a stomach clan, an intestine
Yes.
clan. I mean, all these
Yes.
clans, we don't realize that we are tribal within ourselves already because we just think of ourselves as
That's right.
ourselves,
That's
right?
right.
So in some
right.
sense, like if you take that to then a higher level, like a society of civilization, it's like a clan on top of a clan. It's like a really complex clan.
Yeah.
If
Well, this is a complex social structure. And so the comparison with ants is really useful because ants have specialization and differentiation, but it's hard-coded by instincts. The range, each different ant species has a different combination of not only morphology in their body, but of how do they divide into specific, ant clans, if you will. Do they have soldiers? Do they have aphid farmers? Some ants have aphid farmers and some of them don't, right? I mean, these things are arrived at through a long process of trial and error through biological evolution. We do the same thing, but without having the biological evolution. We just get this trial and error development of cultures over time. And so, we're trying with the tribal structure of society to simulate what evolution does at a biological level over the course of millions of years. And we're trying to pull it off in thousands of years or tens of thousands. And we're more or less successful at it. It's why there don't have to be dozens of different species of us, one for each different kind of habitat or climate. We can acculturate to an area, indigenize in that area, and then develop the clans and weave them together into tribes, which most species can't do. And it's our generic qualities, the things that I've been lamenting for the last several months, that make it possible for us to do this construction. So Cornford goes into this. He talks about this stuff in there. He talks about the ways that the Greeks conceived of the clans. And it's from that the value system of the Greeks that had this idea that the world is divided into different domains. And in each domain, there is a clan that's their area. And there is an Athea associated with that area that you are supposed to pursue. And for each Athea, there are a lot of other things that you are supposed to not pursue. The fishermen should not try to be carpenters. If they try to be carpenters, first of all, they're going to suck at it and somebody's going to get killed. But second of all, they're infringing on the territory of the actual carpenters who need to do carpentry to make a living. And the world can only handle so many carpenters. Somebody's got to fish. So there's got to be these divisions of labor. And the Greeks turned this into a potent morality system. They've got all kinds of terms to talk about crossing the boundaries into things you should not do, taboo stuff. And taboo because it's not your Athea, it's somebody else's Athea. And in their Olympian religion, they just generalized it. I don't know how many of you read enough of the Greek myths to see the myth where the brothers, Poseidon and Hades and Zeus, sit down and divide up the world. And they decide that Poseidon's going to have the ocean. Hades is going to have the dark, cold air under the earth that has souls. And Zeus is going to be fire and have the lightning bolts, the thunderbolts. And he'll have warmth and light and fire. This is them splitting up the world. And they use the exact same terminology to describe their domains as gods, as this is what Cornford says, as human beings use to say, well, you're going to be the fishermen and you're going to be the carpenters and you're going to be the reindeer herders. And that's how we're going to make this work. And all of the same terms around, if you read all these myths about you cross the lines and compare yourself to the gods and they strike you down. Arachne thinks she's a great weaver and says she's an even better weaver than Ariadne. Who was it who took her out? It was Artemis, right? No, it was Athena. And Athena turns her into a spider, right? Arachne, the source of the arachnids. And as a kid, I always thought that was just being mean, but it's not. It's about this issue of you need to know what your Athea is, and you need to not confuse it with other people's Athea, because if you screw up, the fates are going to have you. They're going to eat you for breakfast. You're going to mess everything up. Your intuitions are the intuitions of a fisherman, not the intuitions of a carpenter. And when you go try to do carpentry with fisherman intuition, it is not going to end well for anybody. And so by saying, and they say, and there's an even larger scale split between the realm of the mortals who are finite and the realm of the gods who are infinite. So by comparing herself to the infinite, she has made the fundamental mistake a mortal can make. She's forgotten that she's mortal and that she's going to blunder in the ways that a mortal will do. And that if you handed divine level power and authority to Arachne, the whole world would go out of whack. That's why she's.
So is the modern transformation that is a vocational aptitude test?
I mean, it's related, right? It's related. But we do vocational aptitude tests in a really generic way. We send generic people through generic school systems to produce generic human resources that we believe are every bit as good as somebody coming from a clan that has been raising carpenters for 40 generations and knows how to do it. You know, we sort of make insipid professionals compared to the level of intensity of what the Greeks were after with their clan system, and maybe what tribal people all over the world are after. So I'm glad you brought up ants. I've been meaning to talk about this part of Cornford's book, From Religion to Philosophy. I found it fascinating. And when you read it, you're going to find all of the terms from Greek philosophy are already laid down in the terminology of these tribal systems. Ananke, necessity, the moirai, fate, right? All the words about, you know, the immediate slam that hits you when you hubris, when you reach beyond what you're capable of. All of that's associated with these tribal divisions, with these clan divisions. It's really interesting stuff. And what he's doing is he's bringing back into focus the substrate of life that Homo sapiens evolved to do. Everything above that is sort of icing on the cake, and maybe it's poisonous icing. But the tribal thing is something we did well for hundreds of thousands of years. We know we can do that. Just not the way moderns think of tribes and clans. So thanks for bringing that up, Phil. Ari, what's on your mind, man?
Hello, it's so good to see everybody. Before I get going with a little bit of a soliloquy, I want to say it's so good to see you, Rick, and it was so nice to get on and hear Sharon talk about Heraclitus and Joe talk about objectification and control. And that was one of the conversations about education. I want to talk a little bit about that. But it's also so nice to see Phil. I know we missed you last week. You weren't here. I missed you. So that being said, I'm going to talk about pretty much, I think, the main difference that most anthropologists and neuroscientists at this point talk about humans being different is we don't do Darwinian genetic replication. We do what's called mimetic replication, which is basically what you were saying, what they do in millions of hundreds of millions of years, we do in thousands or less. Like we don't, you know, we're cold. We don't grow hairy skin and fur. We go kill something and make a coat out of it. And the idea is once you see one guy do the coat, then you can learn from him in like 5 or 10 minutes. Obviously, 5 or 10 minutes is metaphorically much faster than it really happens. But if you could process that, and this is the idea of, you know, we have something called a mirror neuron system that allows us to see, monkey do, but not just this. The main part of the mimetic replication in culture is what we call a theory of mind. I can see the intention of the guy who's cutting up the animal to make a fur. It's like, oh, he wants to get warm, right? We can intend that. And then tribes, as you say, as an Atheia, develop these over time to be very successful. And to some degree, it's very reasonable to argue that these tribes are actually different, almost like, I love the ant thing. They're almost like different species of ants. You know, they have they're subspecies of a certain culture. And obviously the main difference between humans and ants here is that any human could be the queen bee or the queen ant, and any human could turn out to be the soldier ant. We don't have a natural specialization. We have a generalization. And this is going to get to education, and even what we were to some degree talking about Nietzsche and his genealogy of morality. And this idea that he really poo-poos Socrates, Plato, he calls them the same guy. He just refers them as a single body, and says that ever since then, we have worshipped rationalization, which we would call noesis, and we totally abandon gnosis. He talks about this in terms of Apollo and Dionysus, but it's basically the same exact. And the idea is to really know oneself and to master oneself and to have morals and to have an idea of really getting to educate and learn and not to get stuck in a herd mentality. You can't just rationalize. It's this paradox. I think I say it nicely, but he would probably agree with this, is that, if our problem is rationalizing too much, we think the solution to that is more rationalization. We need to rationalize better. He's like, no, you're forgetting the whole other part of the equation, which is this vitality aspect, this idea of recognizing that we can't, and this is more for Joe, that we can't control everything. Rationalizing is that treating everything as an object that is a fixed behavior that you can predict and then manipulate. No, the world is essentially chaos. And entropy is what I would say, entropy that's just unpredictable. And there's a balance between this. And you need to introduce your own vitality, and the will to power is truly engaging in gnosis plus noesis. And this idea, you could be an ubermensch if you're just going into the woods and being an amazing, like, so to speak, a beaver, so to speak. You just go in and you cut down, the trees, you make your home. This would be an achievement of really mastering the will to power in this small individualistic case. And my real problem with Nietzsche is how small-minded this is. He doesn't. I mean, if you know anything, if we're going to do a Freudian analysis of Nietzsche's personal life, is he was terrible with relationships. He was so depressed. He was so miserable. And this is because he didn't understand that if everyone is trying to do the will to power in the way he would say it, this is everyone basically learning to have. I talked about this to some degree as their aggressive drive and their pleasure drive just ramped up to 1,000. And the idea is to be truly aggressive means to diminish someone else's aggression, because if I want to control and manipulate my environment, I have to treat everything like an object. And this is where Simone de Beauvoir, in her Ethics of Ambiguity, just rips him to shreds. And this idea of true will to power, if you really want to have the will to power of yourself, if you want to have freedom and free rights, you need to will the power of others. And this makes sense from a market point of view. If you want to be able to buy and sell things in the marketplace, you can't be only the only buyer and seller. You need to be in an exchange, an environment of healthy exchanges of buying and selling. Well, everybody gets to do this. And he sort of implies that society should do this, but he poo-poos the herd mentality. He poo-poos this idea of a tribe. He poo-poos any of this. And he's like, no, it's a balance. You can't just have pure aggression. You need to have a tempered aggression. We can't treat everything like objects. We need to know when to treat things like objects. And like a Sophrosyne, we need to know when to limit our will to power. I would say, if he's really arguing with me, he wants to steal. I want to steel man what Nietzsche's saying. He would say a real will to power is knowing when to limit your will to power, knowing when to guide it, not just go after power, but knowing when power is actually powerful. When in a context, this is what sort of Joe is saying. And this gets back to education. And we were talking about it as education in the modern sense is bad because it just teaches us this more of a programming, what we call a procedural learning. And there's a very famous, you may or may not know, but he's kind of the father. Most people accept this model of education as being the ideal form of education. This is Piaget, and he talks about integration versus accommodation. And what Joe is saying about, and Phil was beautifully saying with nice metaphors, very artistic. I love the art here. Is integration is control and treating everything like objects within an existing framework. This is hard systems, like a skeletal system. We need a certain amount of that. We just don't know how much. We don't know in terms of, we don't have a natural Sophrosyne of what is our skeletal structure supposed to look like. And we also don't know how much our soft systems to be. And this is very much where we go to what is accommodation versus integration. Integration is just existing within a current model and predicting everything as if they're objects. Accommodation is, instead of objectifying everything, treating everything as they truly are to some degree as subjects, which is relational. This is where, in order to do this, you have to be submissive. You have to be soft, right? You have to attend your environment in a natural way where it has its own needs and own dynamics that you have to submit to. You have to get, and in order to do this, you have to get a certain amount of distance from it as opposed to just manipulate it and control it. I'm almost thinking the Lego movie here in Lord Business. You can't just put the Craggle on everything, right, to make it an object. That's pure integration. We need a balance between accommodation and integration. And in our world where it's basically pure indoctrination or pure procedural learning or just general learning to create very much like slaves, that is pure integration. There's no room for accommodation because accommodation is much more slow and long-term, and I would say, takes a lot more investment, like a real relationship, as opposed to I'm just going to put this thing here and put this thing here, put this there. No, you have to learn to do this, and the way you do this with trust and building with your environment, in essence, essentially a safe marketplace. That's the real free marketplace. If I'm going to poo-poo Ayn Rand, a real free marketplace requires a lot of softness, a lot of delicacy, where you're able to submit to each other's needs and you attend each other. And the way you do this is you build trust and safety. If I want to go buy something from another guy in the marketplace, I trust that he's creating a real product that's going to serve my needs. And I trust that his intentions are going to be similar to mine in this balance, not just pure, I'm going to take advantage of somebody and try and sell as much stuff as I possibly can. And so if we really want to re-understand education, which we should say is real education, which I'm going to say here, is what we call real learning, which is some sort of equational balance between softness and hardness, between control and relations, or control and submission, to make healthy relationships, where you have a certain amount of agency, and you also have a certain amount of humility. Humility requires distance and softness, and agency requires a certain amount of will to power, a certain amount of aggression. Yeah. And so to argue against Nietzsche didn't understand the softness and how we need to fit. If we need a certain type of herd mentality, we need a certain type of tribalism where we can cultivate an arete through this. What were they? The atheia, right? We need to braid the atheia. This is a dynamic equilibrium that requires a soft touch. We don't know how to do that very well. I mean, to some degree we do, but we're way out of control. And just like everything in history, we'll have cycles where we're better at this and we're worse at this. And right now it's clear we're very much worse at this, which will breed people like us in this discussion that are craving being better at this, right? And hopefully we can pass this down to our children or the people we learn with, that we need to accommodate each other better. And this is the idea where we make space for each other, and that allows for differences. And these differences that can, from sort of sake, instead of making a controlling, destructive interference pattern, where we just collide to each other as objects do, we will integrate and accommodate with each other by the way of making space for each other and allowing for each other's differences. And that allows for something beautiful, like in music. As Phil doesn't usually talk about music, he does the softness and hardness, I think, of color and shading. This is where I go to musical. We want to be a harmony and a melody. Each individual own person's voice is their melody. And when you break space for this, instead of being so loud and maybe sort of a bully's siren song, you have a soft song that allows for other songs to harmonize, and you make a symphony, which is basically cooperation, which is the braiding of this, and you get like a mimetic transmission, which is basically culture and civilization. And also, to be kind to humans, we're the first species to go beyond Darwinian evolution. We are doing mimetic transmission, which is culture. Nobody else has culture. And therefore, it makes sense. We're going to suck at it to some degree. We are the very first, and we have to learn how to do this, or we're going to die out. And maybe we will die out, and nature will provide other species that will culturally be able to learn. But clearly, nature is building upon Darwinian evolution of just genetic replication with mimetic replication. Right. And we're the first ones to do this, and we're not very good at it yet. Hopefully the key word is yet, that we can be hopeful with conversations like this, listening to all the beautiful voices. Again, Phil, Joe, and Sharon, of course, you, Rick. But, I would love to hear, again, I like hearing from Donald and all the beautiful voices, that we can come together and make a symphony, which is so much more cooperative, and will, to some degree, a symphony I would like to idealize, which I have no evidence for. It's just pure metaphysical speculation. But it's a hypothesis that we can create symphonies, and these symphonies can last. And the signature of this would be individual sophrosune and cultural group sophrosune, where they're intertwined from this top-down, bottom-up dynamic. And we need to learn that, and I hope we can. And I love being here. Thank you, guys. You guys are amazing.
Thank you, Ari. It's a pleasure talking with you and listening to you. This is really interesting stuff, and I'm glad Kenneth turns us on to it. And it's interesting that Kenneth's approach to this philosophy is not to say, here is my system, now you should all worship me. But his approach rather is to constantly be pointing at other people who said things. He wants to point us at Aristotle. He wants to point us at Thucydides. He wants to point us at Gorgias the Sophist. He's constantly trying to get us to look to see that there has been this discussion going on for thousands of years about these problems, and that we can learn who the other participants in this conversation have been, and we can take up the reins of the conversation, continue it, and build upon the insights that they've had. So, you know, it's part of what I enjoy about what we're doing here together is effectively we're taking his invitation, right? And saying, yes, we would like to have a conversation with Thucydides. Yes, I want to hear what Cornford has to say about the tribal roots of philosophy. This is interesting stuff. So, one thing I'm going to take us back to the text, but one thing I was going to mention that I can't remember, I think it was Phil, it was either Phil or Joe said something that made me think about bears. Made me think about bears and the Bear Clan. I don't know how many people are aware. In the Middle Ages, there was this weird phenomenon of traveling circuses with dancing bears, and they were showing bears that could count, or you know, it actually went up to like the 18th, 19th century. They had bears that could ride bicycles. They're just showing bears doing human-like behavior, dressing up in clothes and so on. And I have a Basque scholar that I'm interested in. She studies the origins of the Basque language. And as part of it, she's studying cross-cultural European things that go back far before history. And she says veneration of the bear is a very, very old idea in Europe. No one knows how old it is, but it's deep. We know that there were bear clans. We know in most of the clan-based cultures of Europe, there were bear clans, among others. And you'd think, well, why bears? I mean, I could get a corn clan or a carpenter clan or a reindeer herding clan, but why bears specifically? They don't seem like a very good food source, for one thing. They might eat us rather than us eating them. And, you know, anyway, it goes on. But part of the reason we see that Cro-Magnon man venerated bears, and we see that Neanderthals venerated bears. And if we look at the time frame, we're talking about a time when Europe was covered in ice and snow. Most of Europe was covered in ice and snow. And all of Homo sapiens that we know about from the historical record, or from the archaeological record, was reduced to a few refugia in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and the Italian Peninsula. And that was it. And at the end of the Ice Age, when the glaciers retreated, Europe was repopulated from those two refugia. And the people who were there were the descendants of the earlier Cro-Magnon people. So the Western hunter-gatherers, if you've been reading, you know, about recent stuff about the early genetic history of Europe, the Western hunter-gatherers were those descendants who moved back north. So, but the thing is, during the Ice Age, Europe wasn't vacant. It's not that there was nobody there. There were people there. They just didn't leave any record because they're walking on top of glaciers, you know, and on snowfields and so forth. And in the early days when it's tundra, there are people there. So we're talking about conditions of bitter cold when people have low technology, and people are struck by this is a reconstruction that some anthropologists have made, that Homo sapiens would be struck by the fact that cave bears were thriving in places where Homo sapiens couldn't figure out how to live. They were having whole, healthy, vital lives that were sustainable. And the most natural thing in the world for a clan-oriented, tribal-oriented, mimetic animal like ourselves is to say, how does he do that? What does he do? If we do what the bear does, then maybe we can live the way the bear lives. Maybe we can move into this cold, barren Europe and live there. We could compete for caves. We could follow bears around and see what they eat and when they eat it. And then we can say, well, we're going to be the people that eats those things in those seasons. When is it time for fish? When is it time for berries? When is it time to, you know, hibernate with your stores? It's one of the things that the Lakota say, and that the Salish say, and that the Navajo say, and I wouldn't be surprised if many indigenous people say, which is that Homo sapiens is not superior to the animals. We're the younger brother of the animals. They've got their shit together and we do not have our shit together. And they have a lot of wisdom to impart to us. And we can learn an enormous amount about how to live in the world by studying them. The caribou know what to eat. You know, the bears know what to eat. If you see the bears avoiding some berries and eating others, then as a first stab at how to become indigenized in an area, you might avoid the berries that they avoid and eat the berries that they eat. And it won't always work. Some things are poisonous to one species, but not another. But it'll work more often than just randomly sampling berries and hoping you don't die, right? I mean, it's a viable as a life strategy. And the Salish say they actually did that and continued to do that. They focus on what is the specific, concrete, detailed way of life of each of these animals, and how do we imitate them so that we can live too, where they can live. So you could see how that could arise out of tens or hundreds of thousands of years, or maybe millions of years. I mean, who knows, maybe our predecessor species were doing the same thing, following animals around to see what they do and doing it. And that's how the clan system maybe arose long before we had really sophisticated technology, is that we were trying to figure out how to be a bear, how to be a caribou, or what have you. It's just, I mean, hypothesis. We don't really have the evidence to know, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points in that direction. So they say maybe the reason why everywhere in Europe they venerated bears was there was a time in Europe where if you didn't venerate bears, you couldn't live in Europe. So only the bears knew what the hell they were doing, and people had to imitate them as closely as possible. I mean, they're omnivores, we're omnivores. You know, there's a lot going for us. And you could see how occasionally killing a bear and skinning a bear and preserving the hide and dressing up in the bear's fur would, like Ari was talking about, would be an excellent survival strategy. It's doubly good because the bear is able to thrive maybe in part because of its thick fur, and we don't have that thick fur. But if we could borrow the thick fur from the bear, then it allows us to operate in more conditions that we otherwise couldn't handle, conditions that the bear can handle, partially because of the fur. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Let me just drop the next paragraph. This is the next to last paragraph of section 8. And I know Joe's got his hand up, but I'm gonna push on and then I'll call in. So Joe, remember what you wanted to say and we'll come back to it. I like this paragraph a lot. This paragraph builds strongly on a book that Kenneth recommends, which I've mentioned many times. It's by Gilbert Murray. He's another one of the Cambridge ritualists, along with Jane Harrison and F.M. Cornford. And it's his book, Rise of the Greek Epic, which you could Google and find. It's an outstanding book. It's how epics came to be written. And in it, he talks, among other things, about how late people were still writing what we believe Homer wrote. People were still writing it during the Peloponnesian War. The Iliad and Odyssey were still being edited and rewritten. They were still being edited and rewritten during the Alexandrian age, the Hellenistic era. They were still editing and rewriting the Iliad and the Odyssey. You know, the model that there was a blind guy and he made all this stuff up and traveled around telling stories, or on the other hand, that there was a guild of traveling poets and they made up all these stories and then someday someone wrote them down. That's, Gilbert Murray basically says that's just absurd. There's plenty of evidence that we have that whatever the roots may have been, it might have started out with a blind guy, it might have started out with guild, but the Greeks themselves fully took control over the ongoing job of writing and improving these epics, and they did it right through the historical period. So they weren't finished in the past and then documented. They were being revised over and over. His classic example, I was just telling some folks about this over the weekend. His classic example is the plains of Troy, which in the 19th century archaeologists were searching based on the descriptions in Homer. You know, where could Troy be? Well, we know he describes the plains like this. And Gilbert Murray's like, dear God, you understand that the section on the plains of Troy wasn't about Troy. It was about Thebes, because the epic writers just cut and pasted those passages directly out of the Thebaid and the Seven Against Thebes. It's the plains of Thebes. And then they copied it into the Iliad and they crossed out the name Thebes and wrote in the name Troy. And then they crossed out the names of other people who were part of the Seven Against Troy and replaced them with Achilles and Ajax and and so forth. These aren't the original stories about this. This is not a description of Troy. It's a description of Thebes. And that part of what was happening was there was an earlier stage of Greece in which every polis had its founding epic. There was a Thebaid, there was an Olympiad, there was, stories of the early history of Athens. Every polis had its own myth cycles. And around 776 BCE, when they're trying to claw their way out of the Dark Age, they've invented this idea that they have to have kind of a unity that transcends the polis. They need to unite the Greek-speaking peoples together so that they won't fight as much. This is what Nietzsche writes about in his essay Homer's Contest. They're trying to do deliberate culture engineering to change the Greeks from being centered in conflict to being centered in competition. So they start the Olympian Games and the Nemean Games and the others. And as part of that, they try to shift from everybody's got their own epics to we all have these epics in common. And so they're doing, says Gilbert Murray, what great poets have done since the dawn of time, which is they're stealing all the great lines, right? Because they're great lines. Why, if you're trying to make the great Greek epic, why would you not steal the best lines from all the other previous polis-centered epics? So that's exactly what they did. And there's fragments of the Thebaid that survive, and he does comparisons to show, yeah, this was obviously just, they literally snip, 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 cut it out and pasted it right into the Iliad, and boom, now we have, all these bits and pieces. And archaeologists think that they're about, and we think that there are descriptions of Troy and the people who fought on the plains of Troy, but they're nothing of the kind. They made that up. They're descriptions of Argonautica, Jason and the Argonauts. They're descriptions of the Seven Against Thebes. They're descriptions of all these other things with the names changed. That's what they are. So I stress this to emphasize, because not only does Kenneth recommend that we read that book, because it's very interesting. And frankly, Gilbert Murray is ahead of his time, because you see very few people talking about these topics with the depth that he does in this book. But this paragraph is clearly informed by it, because he's talking about the way that the tragedians and the comic writers and the poets are deliberately reworking Greek religion to tell to squeeze new juice out of old myths, to draw new lessons from the shared religion and the shared stories. It says the version of Oedipus that we see in Sophocles is not the version of Oedipus that we see in tellings of the tale before Sophocles. He has put new stuff in there, or to put it another way, he squeezed new juice out of the story, drawn our focus to different aspects of the story. He says the same is true for Euripides and his portrayal of the Cyclops. He's trying to show the problems of sophistry. And so he writes this comic play that's ostensibly about the Cyclops that Odysseus and his crew encounter. But what it's really about are the assholes in the Piraeus who are dragging Athens into war with Sparta and with Syracuse, right? This is what they're doing, is they're writing, it's like how people do editorial cartoons in the newspaper now, but they did it with myths and plays back in the day. Yes, baby. That's what he's talking about here. So I'll just read us through it. Sophocles reconceived the ancient myth of Oedipus to form a warning for his fellow citizens against mistaking the facile thinking and glib speech of the sophists for true wisdom. So you have to learn to distinguish things that have all the surface appearance of the good things you want, but have none of the roots, none of the actual inner character of the good things you want. You have to look below the surface. Some Heraclitus wisdom there, right? The hidden harmony is best. You have to look under. The tragedy of Oedipus is a calamity not just for his own dark self, but also for the entire city of Thebes that elevated and honored him, only to be forever blackened by his execrable horrors. So this is the warning to Athens. If you let, I'm doing it again, Cleon or Creon? I always do this. Why do I do this? Donald, come off mute. Which one is it? The guy.
It's Cleon.
Cleon,
is the-
Cleon,
is the-
Cleon.
Cleon
Cleon.
is the tanner. who made
Cleon,
up
the
the money.
tanner of Athens, of the Piraeus. Thank you, Donald.
And Cleon is
of
the king.
Athens. Creon is the king from Oedipus. Cleon is the tanner of Athens. And Cleon, right, is going to blacken forever the name of Athens because Athens has raised him up in honor and power, as Thucydides warns us, to allow him to have a say in foreign policy, to the point that Athens attacks the Peloponnesian League, and then Athens wants to go after Syracuse, and Athens dreams of taking on Carthage. And all of that comes from taking somebody of bad character and hitching your cart to his horse, because then the whole polis is drawn into the trail of that bad character. And so the story of Oedipus wrecking Thebes, Sophocles wrote it specifically, says Kenneth Smith, as an illustration of things you shouldn't do, such as that you're doing exactly right now. Athens, knock it off. Stop it. Stop it at once. Right? It's an editorial cartoon in the form of a myth, in the form of a tragic play. Euripides likewise sought to draw the wisdom of the past to bear on present crises. The Cyclops had been portrayed by Homer as the very quintessence of amoral, predatory subhumanity, a cannibal devoid of piety, respect, and justice. Euripides put into the mouth of his Cyclops the words of contemporary sophists, the greatest god of all, my gut. Right? Pragmatism. You know, Polyphemus is a pragmatist. He's focused on how does he fill his stomach? How does he keep himself dry during the rainstorm? How does he get what he wants? Why should he care about Zeus commanding that you be a good host to guests when guests could make perfectly fine food? Why not be a pragmatist? Why not go for, you know, what solves your immediate problems? Why should you care about long-term consequences or complicated philosophies? Just lower everything down to their use value. How does this get me what I want? And his argument, and David occasionally comes off mute to make this point. The point that the point of Polyphemus as a character is to show us what happens in a society where people demand that philosophy justify itself in pragmatic terms. Justify itself in pragmatic terms. It says there are more important things than pragmatic things. And those more important things are the things that pragmatism kills. And when pragmatism kills those things, it kills the whole civilization. Because the civilization isn't just about putting food in people's mouths. That's necessary but not sufficient. It's like the people who chase happiness and end up becoming heroin junkies. It's like, yes, it makes you feel good, but no, it's not healthy for you. Not everything that gives you an immediate return on investment is a good idea. You have to look at these things more deeply, more profoundly, more philosophically, more politically. And that requires something above and beyond pragmatism, something that to the cyclopes of the world is invisible and therefore doesn't exist at all. The hidden harmony is best. There's something more profound at work. But to understand, but only people of a certain character type can understand that. To people of the other two character types, those deeper things are nothing at all. They're where the holes are in the Swiss cheese. They're a part of the cosmos that can't exist, can't be talked about, can't be thought about. And when those people become the majority, they change their language over time until the language loses the words that used to mean those things. And soon nobody can talk about those things or think about them clearly. They become not only unthings in the present, but unthings in the future. Even though, of course, they remain real things that are like gods that have authority over us. And it's a disaster for us to ignore them. This is what he's talking about here. So he's talking about the way that the Greeks had this eristic class. We've talked about this since the beginning of chapter 4, whose duty was a religious duty. Their duty was to find the deeper things that are hard for Douloi and Benalsoi to understand and figure out how to express them in story terms, in terms of characters and the things that happen to them that are so compelling that even the dullest doulos, even the most banal Benalsos, can't help but say, ooh, that Oedipus, man, I don't want to be him. How do you get the point across to people for whom these things are invisible? How do you make them visible and compelling? That's the job, says Kenneth Smith, says Hannah Arendt, says Aristotle. That's the job of the Aristos. And that's why we find Sophocles and Euripides in this paragraph, re-engineering their own religion on the fly to help expose the deeper truths that are evidently not clear enough to their fellow citizens. All right, let's go back. Joe, do you remember what you're going to talk about? Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what I'll try and do is actually just try and somewhat include what you just talked about there a moment ago, is this idea, the guild speech of the sophist, how Alphilosophists against mistaking the facile thinking and guild speech of the sophist for true wisdom comment. I think that that's kind of getting to what we were saying all along, is this this idea that how we're using words actually make it very difficult in order to actually achieve true wisdom. So, I got to hand it to Ari's comment a moment ago, because I feel like it encompassed about 8 of my meetups that I've attended over the past few months. But in any case, I think that there's this other aspect of it as well, is that when Ari was talking about this idea of accommodation versus integration, right? And how that relationship works, and how we learn about the world itself, is that what is being said there is essentially that is that this sophistry is making it impossible to know when to accommodate and when to integrate, because we've broken things down into so many different parts that we are actually becomes meaningless. So this idea of integration becomes so much more difficult, right? So that's where language starts to have its, where does it lose its meaning? Where are we losing meaning in the sense of the essence of the words themselves, right? So from that part, that it becomes a when to accommodate and when to integrate, or even how to integrate. You're talking past one another. So, and it gets to what you were saying a moment ago, is that sometimes the difficulty with sometimes being united or having conflict, right? Because the inability to actually reconcile what we're saying to one another, the lack of clarity that tends to occur. But there is this element that there is this balance. So, Piaget was brought up the idea of a constructivist approach, right? But there still is this idea of syntax that you're going to need to some level, right? So, and this is where the idea of the relationship between the subject and the object, we can get to that, right? That we distort it when we go too far, right? But there is a syntax, there is a basic level of communication that's obviously needed. So it is that balance, I would say, that leads to right judgment and wisdom. Because the balance between understanding how far to go with the way we actually use words and concepts, and will actually, kind of dictate our ability to, when to accommodate, when to integrate, and how to unite versus have conflict. And some of that actually does come out in this idea of the Dionysian and the Apollonian type brain as well. So, I mean, and the relationship there. So, yeah, I mean, and some people even go so far as to actually, I don't know, they'll go so far as to say it's the downfall of the West. Like that's what Ian McGilchrist does say, essentially. And I don't know, I mean, that always seems a little extreme, but it does seem like it could be really painful. Like, I mean, and And it most certainly gets away from the concept of arte.
Yeah.
And eudaimonia as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know those are some scattered thoughts that are all over the place.
But it's good, right? You
Yeah,
cast a
that's
wide net, and it's
like
fine. There's a
now.
lot of things
Well,
to.
this is actually this is the beauty of what you get to do, Rick. You get to reconcile all those. I'm trying to put them and make sense of all of it. Yeah, and it's great.
It goes into the stew that we're all eating together.
Exactly. Yeah, because there
Yeah.
was a lot to put together there, but I think what was captured in the comment and what is actually how it's been, kind of flows from what we've been talking about. It's actually pretty clear. And I even
Yeah.
think about this in terms of constructivist versus universal, like kind of like almost a read and write
Yeah, that's right.
idea. But that's a whole nother thing. Anyway,
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, there was I forgot that I'd shared related to what Joe's talking about. I'd shared a link up above to Nora Bateson's paper, Semathesy, a Word in Progress. I mentioned it about once a month. And she invents this word that's missing from English, which is defined to mean being in a ongoing learning relationship with the world. That's what Semathesy means. And it's an incredibly important subject because it's the definition of life. That things that are more alive have a richer bandwidth of communication with the world. They're paying more attention to what's happening around them, and they have more capacity to change their own behavior in response to what they detect in the world around them. A rock isn't very alive because a rock is oblivious to what's happening in the world. Rocks don't notice things until you hit them with a hammer, or you shine the sun on them and they heat up. And their reaction is predictable. It's not adaptive. It doesn't have any kind of scope for changing for different circumstances. But, an amoeba under the exact same conditions as a rock, despite being so much smaller, it has semathesy, and it's responding to a wide variety of things that are happening around it, including other amoebas, as well as the presence of bacteria, which it hunts and eats. So, it's more alive than the rock because it has more semathesy than the rock. This is the way I've been talking about this in the past. But to put it in Ari's terms, the rock is harder and firmer and more orderly, but less alive as a result of that orderliness. It has taken law and order too far. It has very little capacity to respond to the world, and very little choice. The Kraglin discussion from the Lego movie, the glue, everything must be glued down. Anyone who hasn't seen the Lego movie, by the way, it is brilliant. You have to see it. It's fantastic. It's comedy in the way that Greek comedies are comedy. It's depicting things that are much more interesting than what's on the surface. And so, this issue of rigidity versus adaptability, this issue of how much semathesy do you let guide your life? If you make your society rigid and always enforcing the same pattern, then that society is more dead. It has less semathesy. It's more like a rock than a society in which that's more responsive and adaptive. So here you see in this paragraph where, Kenneth's talking about the Greeks are rewriting their own religion on the fly in response to current events. Now, can you imagine the shitstorm in the United States if people started rewriting the Bible on the fly in response to problems that were emerging in contemporary events? They'd be like, don't you contaminate the word of God. And of course, what the Greeks think is, well, first of all, none of this is the word of God. These are our words trying to describe God. And we're mortals and we're flawed, so we get things wrong. So if we don't improve our words over time when we learn more, then we're not very faithful or religious or pious, are we? To just rigidly say we got it right the first time is to claim to be a god, to have a godlike appreciation of what the gods want and mean. So there's hubris all over the idea of a rigid, locked-in religious structure. So we see the semathesy in action in this paragraph where the Greeks are rewriting their own religion on the fly to be adaptive. Go ahead, Joe. You were going to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so yeah, what you did was what you do. You clarified the idea. So No, I mean, I think that that's actually beautifully said in the sense that we were talking about it a little bit earlier, this idea of the absolutism of this is how it has to be. Then you're actually imposing on nature as you're actually working within nature. So that's where this difficulty of well, this is what the word means, and this is what it always, is always going to mean. Meaning, well, I shouldn't say that. So the idea of concepts is actually important to maintain in order to be adaptable, because you need to be able to reconcile the ideas themselves, right? But it's when you become very domain specific and start enforcing those concepts on everything, and that's where the hammer always looks like a nail. And it's like, well,
Exactly.
that's really distorted. And and people wonder why we're confused.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's weird, when you look at language change from the context of semanticy, then you can start to ask the kind of value-laden questions that Kenneth Smith likes, which is not, is all change good or is all change bad, but which specific kind of change are you advocating, sir? Are you advocating the introduction of new terminology that will let us express things we could never express before? Or are you saying that we should all lose the term sophrosyne because that's passe, and really you should just do what I say and forget about questions like, is this healthy or unhealthy? There's each change could be evaluated like we're intelligent people who have a vested interest in whether we survive and our species survives and the world survives. But no, in the modern world, everything reduces down to these pinhead, and I do mean pinhead, zero-dimensional. You're either for all change and nobody should ever prescribe anything, or you're against all change and everything should be prescribed and locked down. It's like, on what planet did those become the only two choices? Are the most radical, extreme, insane positions. But that's where we are, right? Modernity likes very simple postulates. You can you can buy any color of Model T as long as you pick black. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I really love the story about the use of the story to create a new dimension. Not only does it show a degree of the importance of creativity in terms of reinventing and exposing what it is, but it seems like it's also very important that it was really directed through a self-criticism of one's own decadence. I mean, I think that's a kind of a moral dimension that seems to me and the self-criticism was really an important part, because it's not just a matter of, and I want to contrast that because the Romans also wrote about Troy, which is interesting. Augustus, uh, uh, I guess got tired of the myth of Romulus and Remus finding Rome, right? Because it just seemed like it doesn't seem very inspiring, bunch of two guys being raised by a wolf. So he wanted to invent a new story, but it was how the Romans transformed it was really an objectification, which the Romans do. Everything is turned into a thing, an object. And first of all, Aeneas was a Trojan. And of course, the Trojan lost the war. But one of the way you got back at it, it was like Aeneas escaped and sail around the Mediterranean, And it's the story sounds so much like Odysseus's journey that is like, wow, that's a transformation. Of course, he also sailed through many of the trials and tribulations, and he also landed in Carthage, where the queen Dido fell madly in love with. So that was a very interesting included Carthage, and of course, when Aeneas left, Dido sort of fell apart in a funny way, like that was a foretelling, I guess, of the the decay of Carthage. But what happened, in a sense, is by finding it, it was a story that tells about not a criticism, but honoring ideas and the creation of Rome, objectification of things, in some sense. In fact, they have found Troy. Maybe I shouldn't say they found Troy. They had invented Troy, a kind of Disneyland, if you want to put it that way, at which a lot of Romans would go and visit Troy because that was their origin. And so the fact that they would create a spectacle of Disneyland to authenticate the beingness, the objectification of Rome, is kind of very, very interesting. So it's almost a complete opposite of a self-criticism of decadence versus the praise of, the objectification, the glorious beginning of Rome. And of course, the Romans were objectifying everything, aqueducts, all sorts of things, mechanical process, even the army is pretty much objectified. So, and objectification of the conquering of lands and so forth. So a very interesting that it took that turn. And I wonder whether, to what degree, of course, I guess ancient world, there was other civilization that objectify things, but not like Rome. To what degree that wasn't the beginning of the objectification of the world that we lived in. We still live in, how should I say, the ruins of Rome.
Yes.
Civilization. So that's very interesting. It has left this mark on us. So there it is, Aeneas and Troy.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up Aeneas and Troy. A classic example of the difference between the Greeks and the Romans is what they consider an epic. The Romans are like, man, that epic's pretty cool. We should get us one of those, right? So we're going to make an epic. But the Greek epic is talking about the catastrophic tragedy of Homo sapiens and how we have this weakness in us that can turn our greatest virtues into vices. And the smartest person can accidentally destroy civilization because of his powers, because of this blindness that mortals have. And it sets in motion the whole project of post-Dark Age Greek civilization that says we are coming together to attempt to not repeat our own ancestors' mistakes. And our ancestors weren't bad guys, they were the heroes. It was the heroes who wrecked everything. So you got to be careful about heroes, and you got to be careful about glory and honor and virtue and that stuff. You got to try to figure out, how do you not screw over the whole world in the pursuit of your goals? This is weighty stuff. But the Aeneid takes the tropes from the epic. Hey, let's sail around and we'll have some encounters with monsters, and hey, let's visit the underworld and all that stuff. But really, it's not pessimistic at all. It's saying, isn't it cool to be Roman? Right? This is what the Aeneid is about. Rome is cool. We're cool people. We came from a cool place. We have a cool background. Hey, it's cool to be us. This is our epic. And you're like, I don't think the word epic means what you think it means. I'm back in The Princess Bride. I'm like, you got a lot of details right, and it's beautifully written, but somehow you've missed the entire point of the epics that you're imitating. And you've instead proposed the exact opposite of that point, which is no need to be skeptical. It's all glorious. We're number one, right? This is the ancestry of the U.S. chant. We're number one, USA, USA. This is the Romans in the Aeneid and what they think an epic looks like. It's fantastic. It's astonishing, because that centerpiece of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that concern about the existential crisis of Homo sapiens, is almost impossible to miss unless you're constitutionally incapable of noticing it, like the Romans were. Right? They knew those epics by heart, line by line. They went through the whole thing. They knew it all. And yet nowhere in there did they see any reference to there being a problem with being human. At least not a problem that couldn't be solved by Rome. Hey, it's like, it's fantastic. It's the Banausic perception of the world in a nutshell. The Aeneid is a work of genius and excellence. It's astonishingly well written in every way except one. The only thing it's missing is the whole point of the exercise, which is just a fantastic blind spot to have. But that's the blind spot that Banausoi and Douloi have. They can't see why there should be any Aristoi. No need. There's no problem. We don't need them to solve the problem because we got no problems here. So, anyway, let's do the last couple, the last paragraph, right? It's in two parts here. There's the first part, and oh no, that's, what did I put in the second part? No, here comes the second part. All right, last paragraph. This is the end of chapter 4. We've only been at this 114 sessions. This is the end of chapter 4. We're about to leave the ancient world behind, and next week we're going to start with the medieval world. Oh my God, Hermagerd. But here's his transition. The Greeks initially lacked a term to distinguish the cleverness of the predatory sophists from the wisdom of the sublime philosophers, but came to realize the difference in spades. One of the big Achilles heels of ancient civilization is that they didn't know what a Banausos was. Some Banausoi they took to be Douloi, other Banausoi they took to be Aristoi. They had the term for the general class within their economy, but with the sophists teaching the Banausoi how to engage in convincing rhetoric, they got confused. And they didn't, for a long time in the writings, if you read Plato and Aristotle and Heraclitus and Thucydides and others, you'll see a much stronger distinction between Douloi and Aristoi than you can see between Banausoi and either of the other two. They come up from time to time. There are times when Aristotle spotlights the market and its problems. But when he's not doing that, whenever he's just talking about character or the soul or what have you, they're constantly talking about, you need to control your emotions, your appetites, all the Dulic stuff. You have to control that. And that's the road to being an Aristos. And what that's missing out is, no, that's the road to being a Banausos. There's another road that leads from being a Banausos to an Aristos. But the Greeks don't get clear about that until Athens is falling apart. And then they start scribbling as fast as they can, going, wait, we missed something. We missed something really big, and it's too late for us. Save yourselves. We put this message in the bottle in the hopes that it won't happen to you like it happened to us. And of course, unfortunately, we who are receiving the bottle, it happened to us at a level they can't even imagine. A world in which everything is Banausic. There aren't any options. Banausoi run everything. There's plenty of Douloi, but they all live in a Banausic world. Yeah, actually, before I go on, let me share the link to chapter 5, because that'll be our reading for next week. So here is the link. Right. I'm going to share it with everyone. So there you guys, copy it out of there. And you can do the reading between now and next week. But let's finish the ramp up. So what he's saying here is that this tripartite division that they had in their economy, it took a while for them to figure out that also existed in people's character to a level that made the Banausoi qualify as a third type of character. Slaves versus free people, they were really big on. But in slaves, they were usually thinking about Douloi. And part of the reason for the confusion is Solon had done his reformation of the constitution and given Banausoi the vote. So in Athens, Banausoi were treated like Aristoi as a voting class. And that sort of created the idea that Banausoi maybe weren't really a third type. I mean, certainly they couldn't be that dangerous if you're letting them vote. The reason you don't let the Douloi vote is because you think they're dangerous. So if you're letting the Banausoi vote, you must think that they're okay. And of course, that was a hideous blunder on the part of Athens. So in the same way that in the Greeks, you see this transition from a mythos culture to a logos culture, you also see this transition from being unfortunately clueless about the Banausoi to learning all too late what a danger they are. It's one of the gifts that ancient Greece bestows upon us, is to see what happens when you underestimate the power and rapaciousness of predatory character types. He goes on, Greek political culture framed by Solon and Pericles to rein in feral self-interest, and Greek philosophical culture, inspired by Heraclitus and Socrates, to transcend idiotist self-bias. Both proved permeable to the sophistic viruses that presaged the tenor of modern subjectivist disorder. So, you know, they didn't have enough of an immune system against sophistry and Banausea. And as a result, it got into their system and infected it and changed it. It's not, again, he's not saying that it was perfect before that, but it had strengths that it rapidly lost as it Banausified, as it corrupted into sophistry. He continues, the corruptibility and rapine that Christianity sought to vanquish were not the condition of natural humans. And boy, I can't underscore that enough. Right? Because in the modern world, we say without all this order, we would all degenerate into rape and pillaging and violence, that's the natural state of human beings. And the Greeks didn't think it was. Kenneth Smith doesn't think it is. He says, the corruptibility and rapine were the predation that the amoralist or nihilist sophistic revolution fueled. It's sophistry and nihilism that caused the eruption of chaos and corruptibility and rapine. And chaos here, it shouldn't be read as having the modern term, right? Law and order versus chaos. It should be read as having the ancient term. What makes an organism live is that it organizes its resources so that they are not a chaos of competing resources, but a cosmos of harmonized resources. Cosmos versus chaos, remember, going all the way back, this is the central value system of the Greeks. It's why they believe that they succeeded in conquering, you know, as the branch of Indo-Europeans that they were. Why did they conquer this peninsula and become the Greeks? It's because their fighting force, they taught themselves not to fight against each other, but to fight against the enemy and to coordinate their actions rather than being a bunch of individuals trying to have individual battles. They could form platoons and fight in a coordinated fashion. And the cosmos was the term that they used for their fighting unit. It was also the term they used for the entire cosmos. They used both at the same time, and they meant it the same way. They say, an organism is a cosmos. It has harnessed its resources and energies so that they work in a productive fashion to promote its life and vitality, and not to vitiate and fight against itself and tear itself to pieces. And also not to be passive prey to whatever external forces push on it, like a rock is, but to be alive like an amoeba is. This is what they mean by chaos versus cosmos. So, you know, what they're saying here is that they had spent centuries, maybe thousands of years, putting together the cosmos of the Greek world. But it only took decades for Banausea to rip it to pieces. So he says, and that had been customary in Rome since its founding by legendary brigands. But part of why Augustine didn't like the Romulus and Remus story is that it was an attempt to capture the true origins of Rome, which is they were brigands, right? Why did they objectify everything around them? Because it's like, hey, that's a nice necklace you got. That's a nice bag of money you got. Say it'd be a shame if anything were to happen to that. You know, they were thieves and brigands. And that was the origins of Rome. There's a reason they developed into the world's first mafia empire. They were thieves. And so, you know, Augustine decided he wanted to have a better, sorry, Augustus decided he wanted to have a better founding story than that. So he commissioned one. Hey, let me get one of them smart guys. We'll have him write us a story. He'll make us a genealogy, and it'll be awesome. We'll come from cool people because we say so. And you know, he thought that would work, and it did, which is disappointing. And now he's talking to the threshold, the boundary between the ancient world and the medieval world when he says, what revolutionary Christianity knew of humanity, that is to say, what is Augustine railing against in the city of God? What is it that he's angry about? What is the city of man that he complains of? That was not antiquity in its authoritative glory. He wasn't railing against, the Greek city-states during their peak. He didn't know them, couldn't imagine them. What he had was Rome, which Kenneth Smith calls a dissolute and desperate caricature. A social order whose rationality and character, whose humanizing form and values had been spent. So it was withering and dwindling, even as it was conquering Europe. And at the height of its powers, its moral center was gone. And you can find Romans who complain about this during the imperial, although they have to be careful when they say it. It's like they don't end up, being, killed. But there are plenty, like Tacitus, who will call out the empire's claims to glory and say, it seems to us that modern imperial Romans are an inferior type of person compared to the old Republican Romans, who had virtues of humility and, quietude and simplicity and working hard that have been lost in this era when we seem to think we can just conquer everything and reap the rewards of conquest. So even the Romans, who lacked the philosophical acuity of Greece at its height, even they thought that the Rome of Augustine's era was a mess. It was a hollow ball. It was a hollow doll, to quote the book by Bonhoeffer about Japanese culture. And he ends with the quote from Polybius, right? Those abuses and corruptions which in time destroy a government are sown along with the very seeds of it. The Hegelian dialectical way of reframing this is that what took Rome down was not external threats. It was Rome that took Rome down. It was Rome's own character, right? Because we are not just who we are also the fruits of our past and the seeds of our future. We carry our character around within us, and things are unfolding within it, and we're becoming someone new all the time. And it was always in the character of this empire of brigands that they would eventually turn to brigandom and squabbling, and they would make a desolation and call it peace. And that's no foundation to build an enduring order out of. And these lessons, which have been there for thousands of years for anyone to learn, were completely oblivious. They might as well have not been present when our founding fathers were trying to decide what kind of government they wanted to make the United States based on. And they decided, well, we shouldn't base it on Athens because Athens didn't last that long. Let's base it on Rome because they were around for centuries. And, there's Tacitus and Polybius spinning in their grave going, dear God, Rome, really? Rome? Augustine spinning in his grave. Really? The city of man? The one I wrote a whole book about, saying this is corruption at its finest? That's what you want America to be based on? What? It's right up there with a man who kept a sex slave in his basement, right? All men are created equal. We have, these truths are self-evident: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What about the slaves you're keeping, Jefferson? Do they have a right to liberty? There is an incoherency in the worldview and the perceptiveness of the people who created the American government. And it's not like a subtle little detail they're getting wrong. They're getting wrong the same scale of things that Aeneas got wrong in writing the Aeneid and calling it an epic. You only left out the most important parts. This is a kingdom of brigands. You do not want to model yourself on them. But we did. We wanted a Pax Americana just like the Pax Romana. So in these three, I said that he would do this at the beginning. In these 3 paragraphs, he has gestured across 800 years of decline of the ancient epoch and brushed it off as, sure, learn about it if you like. There's a lot of things to learn about. You can study Latin, you can study Rome, there's things to see there, but you're not going to learn anything about the heart of the ancient ethos by looking at that withered, desiccated, rotting corpse. That is Rome. You know, that's not the soul of the ancient epoch. That's just what's left after its psyche has departed. And with that, he shows us to the door, and that's the end of chapter 4. And he moves on to a series of chapters in which we're going to start next week, in which we begin talking about the medieval epoch and the medieval worldview. Now, of course, in that, he's constantly going to be referring not just to how moderns see medievals, and not just how medievals see medievals, which is the core lesson of this next group of chapters, but also what do medievals look like from an ancient point of view? Now that we've spent the time in chapter 4 to develop something like an ancient point of view that we can from time to time take on, we want to apply it to looking at the medieval and the modern epochs, and he's going to do that. So the first section is more about just that one epoch, the ancient, but the chapters to come are simultaneously talking about 2 epochs, because we're going to talk about the medieval epoch from 2 different perspectives. And here endeth my bit, and let's go to Q&A before we wrap up for today. Phil, what's on your mind?
Well, first of all, I want to ask, make sure that, do we have a text for the next one like we had for this one? Or
Yes.
I mean, you published something, but is that just a transitional thing, or do we have like an extended text?
Yeah, it's all on that website that David put together.
Okay. Okay.
And so that link will take you to chapter 5, but you can always look on the left for the chapters. There's going to be a whole series of chapters about the medieval epoch.
Okay. Well, the second thing I want to say is that I want to give a limited defense for Rome. So let's put it this way. I'm particularly defending them in terms of the military, because, you know, Rome had a problem because they were being attacked by all sorts of people. So they had to create a buffer zone. This is how they justify it, right? A buffer zone to defend so that people can't come and defend Rome. Of course, once they conquered the buffer zone,
now they had a
they have to
problem.
defend that, right?
Right. Just one thing follows another, right?
That's right. They have to defend that after another, after
That's
another.
right.
So they didn't really have a military offense. They have a military defense, just like we had. Not the let's say, not the Secretary of War, but the Secretary of Defense.
That's right. Or as Torquemada put it, I'm not a bad guy. I'm torturing you for your own good. I'm really the good guy here if you think about it the right way.
So let's just look at it from the right perspective. They're just really always being on the defensive. They were not really conquering people. We're just trying to defend themselves.
Yes. Yeah, this is what Hitler said, right? Is it Lebensraum? Is that the term? We're not trying to conquer anybody. We just need some room so that, you know, people won't conquer us. It's just, I don't know how we just accidentally ended up with all of Europe. Who could have foreseen this? What should we take next? How about Russia? We're the good guys here when you think about it the right way. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think that one issue that you start to see emerge is this, you know, and you kind of touched on it, but this versus the mythos versus, you know, logos, is this element of storytelling and how that actually relates to this. When you only have one story, but that this is the way it is, then you're automatically going to have something that's static and stagnant, and that's not necessarily going to have any kind of any level of adaptability. And inability to adapt, you know, kind of leads to, you know, obviously, where there are cracks in the story in the system, and then it becomes almost like there's context is no longer meaningful because everything's the same context, and that's just not true. So you're enforcing everything on your patterns on nature again. Which actually gets to this idea that I went in the chat a little bit about spontaneous order, and how things emerge, right, from their interactions with each other. And so therefore, it's the interactions of multiple stories that something better emerges. versus actually the idea of a single story. So,
Yeah.
and I think that that's where, that's where Piers Kenneth is going with the idea, that, how essentially the Greeks are kind of frantically trying to figure out and how to recapture some of the things that they had actually lost. In any case.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, Joe. Thanks. Steve, final comments. Oops. Yeah, come off mute.
I was just going to make the point that in the 2nd century BC, we not only have to look at Rome. It's something that struck me about Rome itself, that you look in the change of attitudes and behaviour in between the end of the 2nd Punic War and the 3rd Punic War. The Romans had occupied Greece around the 2nd Punic War, had great respect for the Greek culture. But by the time of the 3rd Punic War, they're behaving just as you said. Oh, there's a bit of culture, I'll grab that and take that home. I'll wreck a city or two. There's always plenty more, but we cannot forget the remnants of Alexander's empire were another big part of the story, and they were going downhill as well. And Greece itself, a lot of people left Greece during Alexander's empire, and what was brought back in was slaves. So Greece itself became a nation of big people, landowners, and the slaves that were working the place. But famously, something about Greek learning as a famous thing still persisted. And it was still there when the Roman Empire was falling. The Greeks were still viewed, the Greek language was still viewed as a thing culture. Yeah, but I just thought I'd mention that the later Diadochi, if you like, the later successors.
Yeah.
There was probably about a century after Alexander that suddenly felt this is the great moment. We have the material. We'll build the great library.
Yes. Yes.
And about a century later, the Ptolemaic ruler was closing down the great library because the librarians started playing politics.
Yes.
And trying to undermine him. And I remember Spengler and Steiner believed that our culture was repeating certain elements in an exact phase of about 2,160 years from the Roman Greco epoch. And if that's true, democracy as we know it's going to disappear. And the future undemocratic rulers are going to look at our academia and our universities as something that's gone off the rails, something that's causing trouble, and just close it down.
Mm-hmm.
Send in the troops with the pointy sticks, poke all these self-serving academics, show them where the door is and where the front gate is.
Yes. Yes.
Because this happened before in a certain sense.
It has. It's like Chekhov's gun. What's the point of having the world's biggest military if you don't use it? I mean, that was what Nixon said about nuclear weapons in Vietnam. He wanted to nuke Vietnam to win. And it took that war criminal Kissinger to talk down Nixon from the idea of nuking Vietnam. He's like, everybody in the world will hate us forever. You let it go. You could just, it's not worth it. Let it go. But that idea of what is, how can you feel powerful if you don't wield the power? And so, when if university or a library is frustrating the rulers, they're like, well, of course I send in the army or the police. and shut them down, because otherwise that makes me feel inadequate. I didn't claw my way to the top of the ladder of power to feel inadequate. I need to rough some people up so I feel like the big monkey. So yeah, there's unpleasant things coming. You just know by the laws of storytelling. It's you don't put the gun on the mantle if it's not going to be shot. And then I guess final comments to Ari, and then we'll wrap up for the week. Go ahead, Ari.
Fantastic. I really just want to say something genial and totally non-topical, which is this is my favorite few hours of the week in terms of learning. I find that there's nothing I've almost ever experienced that rivals this. It's so fantastic, and it has to do with one of my favorite ways of thinking is the top-down, bottom-up dynamics. We have a great leader, Rick. I love the way you seem prepared and able to lead us into learning. And then equally important, probably more important, is you'd be all by yourself learning in a room if the rest of us weren't here. And the group that's here, I could say everybody's name, but basically everybody who's on camera, I only leave out the people who aren't on camera because I don't have an image of them. But Steve, Phil, Sharon, Joe, Donald, you guys make this so fantastic. I'm just so thankful. I have so much gratitude and so much humility here, and those two things come together just make love, and this is like amazing for me, and I'm just so thankful, and I really love participating, and I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you. I love it too. I learned so much from all of you. I really do.
I
By
got
the
a
way,
quick
Ari,
question. Are we changing to Tuesdays now?
No, I just had a bad work
Okay.
deadline, so I had to work all day yesterday.
Okay. Thanks.
So,
hey, by the
Mondays-
way,
Mondays-
Ari, I was here last week, but my computer all fell down. So that's how much we depend on technology.
That's right. You're not here if your computer's not here.
That's right. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and are prepared to come all medieval next week.
And carry it
Amazing.
on.
We're having a hurricane come ashore on Thursday, so let's
Oh
see.
my God. Stay safe.
Yes, I'm in South Florida, so there you go.
Yeah,
Live dangerously.
that's
Oh,
right.
live
That's
dangerously.
right. That's right,
Yeah.
Steve.
Nice. Good. All right. Take
Yes.
care, everybody.
Have a
All
great
right.
week.
Bye-bye.